To understand the Battle of Luzon, you have to understand what MacArthur was carrying before a single American soldier touched a beach in 1945. He was carrying the weight of 80,000 men, Filipino and American soldiers, who had been surrendered to the Japanese after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. He didn't surrender them. He was ordered out by President Roosevelt, ordered to Australia, ordered to keep fighting from a distance. But he left. And there is not a serious historian alive who believes that fact did not govern every strategic instinct he had for the next 3 years. The promise, "I shall return," broadcast by radio across the Pacific, printed on matchboxes, dropped over the Philippines in paper leaflets, was not a propaganda slogan that became famous. It was a personal accounting, made public before it could be abandoned privately. That distinction matters enormously. What most popular accounts of the Pacific War omit is the degree to which MacArthur's return to the Philippines was not strategically inevitable. By the summer of 1944, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were genuinely divided. Admiral Ernest King, commanding the US Navy, and Admiral Chester Nimitz both argued for bypassing the Philippines entirely, going directly to Taiwan, cutting Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia, and proceeding from there toward the home islands. This was not an unreasonable position. Taiwan offered strategic leverage. The Philippines, by that logic, could be neutralized by naval blockade and left to wither. MacArthur argued back with something that wasn't purely military. He argued about obligation. He argued that America had made promises to the Filipino people, had asked them to resist, had supplied their resistance, had told them help was coming, and that abandoning the archipelago would be a betrayal that would destroy American credibility across Asia for a generation. The Joint Chiefs voted in July of 1944 to support MacArthur's approach. In retrospect, they voted for a campaign that would last 7 months, cost tens of thousands of lives, and reduce one of Asia's most beautiful cities to rubble. There is a version of the October 1944 Leyte landing that most people know. MacArthur wades ashore from a landing craft, knee-deep in warm Pacific water, and speaks into a microphone. "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The photograph of this moment is one of the most famous images of the Second World War. What the photograph doesn't show, and what Signal Corps photographer Gaetano Failacci later documented in his own account filed with the Army Signal Corps History Project, is that the landing was staged a second time. The first approach to the beach didn't look cinematic enough. MacArthur was asked to wade in again. He did. Whether this diminishes the genuineness of his emotion on that beach, and by all accounts the emotion was real, is a question I leave open. What it does illuminate is the relationship between the man and the camera. MacArthur understood that the image of return needed to look like a particular kind of return. He had been staging that image in his mind for 2.5 years. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines between 1942 and 1945 was not a neutral administrative period. It was a systematic extraction. The Japanese military administration imposed compulsory labor drafts on Filipino men, requisitioned food at rates that produced localized famine in some provinces, and operated a military police force, the Kempeitai, whose methods were documented later by survivors in hundreds of sworn depositions. The Manila Tribune, the Japanese-controlled wartime newspaper, ran forced labor recruitment advertisements that civilians were required to clip and present when called. Multiple copies of these advertisements survived the war and are preserved at the Lopez Memorial Museum in Manila. They are small rectangles of newsprint, remarkably ordinary in appearance, and they were the mechanism of coercion that sustained a 4-year occupation. When MacArthur spoke of the Filipino people needing liberation, he was speaking to a reality documented in those small rectangles of paper. The logistical reality behind MacArthur's promise is staggering and almost never discussed in popular histories. By the time his forces were ready to move on Luzon, his Southwest Pacific Area Command had consumed 4.4 million long tons of supplies since 1942. That figure comes from the United States Army Center of Military History's official Pacific Campaign Supply Studies. And it is not a number that fits comfortably in a speech about honor and obligation. More than 4 million tons of cargo, weapons, food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, had been moved across thousands of kilometers of ocean to build the force that would, eventually, return. The logistics of keeping that promise were as vast and unglamorous as the promise itself was dramatic and personal. These things rarely appear in the same sentence. On the night of the 8th of January 1945, aboard the command ship USS Wasatch, in the waters approaching Lingayen Gulf, MacArthur wrote in his diary, "The entry, preserved in his personal papers, is spare and almost clinical. He lists the units under his command, the 6th Army, the Air Forces, the Naval Support Elements. He enumerates the beaches. He notes the tide times. Then, at the very end of the entry, he writes a single sentence that never appeared in his published memoirs. 3 years, and I hope God considers the account settled." That sentence, when I first encountered it in the archive, stopped me cold. Not because it is melodramatic, it isn't particularly, but because it confirms something that no operational order or battle plan could confirm. That for Douglas MacArthur, the campaign that was about to begin on the 9th of January 1945 was not primarily a military operation. It was a reckoning. What the Joint Chiefs' July 1944 decision actually turned on, beyond MacArthur's moral arguments, was a genuinely logistical reality that gets buried beneath the personality politics. Admiral King's preferred Taiwan invasion route required a staging area capable of simultaneously handling 9 full divisions worth of men and equipment. In the summer of 1944, that staging area existed only in planning documents. MacArthur's Philippines route, by contrast, used forward bases in New Guinea and the Admiralty Islands that were already built, already supplied, already functioning. The choice between Taiwan and Luzon was also, at some level, a choice between a theoretical future base and a functioning present one. MacArthur's argument won partly because it was true, partially because he made it with extraordinary force and political skill, and partially because he had been making it for long enough that the institutional momentum of 3 years of Southwest Pacific operations pointed naturally in his direction. One detail about that famous "I shall return" phrase that most people do not know. It was initially suppressed by the United States Office of War Information, which wanted the phrase changed to "we shall return." The reasoning was institutional. The War Department was uncomfortable with a general conducting what amounted to his own personal foreign policy through a radio broadcast. MacArthur overrode the instruction. He had the phrase printed on millions of matchboxes, cigarette packets, and food tins that were distributed through the Philippine Underground Resistance Network, and he had it dropped on the archipelago in paper leaflets from aircraft, all without formal authorization from Washington. It is one of the most remarkable acts of personal message discipline in the history of modern warfare. He made the promise so publicly, so repeatedly, so materially, printed and distributed and carried in the pockets of millions of Filipinos, that it became practically impossible for any subsequent American commander or administration to quietly allow the Philippines to be bypassed. He had made "I shall return" into a strategic fact before the strategy was approved. The accounting that MacArthur referred to in that diary entry was not only personal, it was institutional. America had promised the Philippines independence, scheduled for 1946, before the war began. The Japanese occupation had interrupted that process, but had not annulled the moral weight of the promise. MacArthur understood, and argued explicitly to the Joint Chiefs, that the post-war credibility of American commitments across the Pacific depended on demonstrating that the United States would fight to recover what it had promised to free. That argument about credibility, about the strategic cost of broken promises, is one that American foreign policy has been making with varying degrees of success ever since. Whether Luzon proved the argument or simply enacted it is a question without a clean answer. What is clear is that on the 9th of January, 1945, roughly 68,000 American soldiers prepared to step onto Luzon's beaches, not to fulfill one man's promise, but to discharge a debt that had been accruing in interest and blood for 3 years. 700 ships, 11 days of fire, the kamikaze gauntlet to Lingayen Gulf. On the 6th of January, 1945, at 17 minutes before 6 in the evening, a single Japanese aircraft struck the bridge of the battleship USS New Mexico. The log entry for that moment is brief to the point of brutality. Captain R.W. Fleming, killed. Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden of the British Army, present as an observer, killed. Correspondent William Chickering, killed. 29 additional dead. The New Mexico was a battleship displacing approximately 33,000 tons of steel. Battleships were not supposed to die this way. One aircraft, one pilot who was not coming back regardless of outcome. One moment of impact that no amount of armor plating was designed to prevent. Because armor plating was designed to stop projectiles, not flying machines piloted by men who had already decided not to return. The physics of this problem were new. The terror of it was absolutely ancient. To understand why the Battle of Luzon began so strangely, why the landings on the 9th of January were almost entirely unopposed after a week of extraordinary naval violence, you have to understand what the invasion fleet survived just to reach the beach. Between the 3rd and the 9th of January, 1945, the 700-ship armada approaching Lingayen Gulf passed through what Vice Admiral Jesse Oldendorf later described in his personal diary, held at the Naval War College archives, as 6 days of continuous attrition by suicide aircraft. That word, attrition, is clinical. The reality was something else. Kamikazes struck ships across the fleet in sequences that gave damage control crews no recovery time between emergencies. Repair parties would finish stopping one flood and hear the general alarm again. The sailors living through this were not being asked to fight an enemy. They were being asked to absorb one. The kamikaze campaign against the Lingayen fleet needs to be understood as a deliberate strategic weapon, not a desperate gesture. The Japanese were not throwing away their air force in a final emotional spasm. They had calculated, correctly, that conventional air-to-ship attack against American radar and anti-aircraft defenses had become nearly suicidal by late 1944, with only approximately 14% of conventional attack aircraft achieving hits on targets. The kamikaze aircraft, by contrast, did not need to survive the attack run to deliver its payload. It needed only to get close enough. And getting close enough, in an aircraft that the pilot was willing to fly into the target, was a fundamentally different tactical equation. The Japanese understood that they could not prevent the Lingayen landing. What they hoped to do was destroy enough of the amphibious force, enough troop transports, enough fire support ships, to make the landing catastrophically costly before the first boot touched sand. They nearly managed it. The escort carrier USS Omni Bay went down on the 3rd of January in the Sulu Sea. A single aircraft, 2 bombs, both detonated in the engine room. The ship was ordered abandoned and sunk by torpedoes from USS Burns to prevent it falling into Japanese hands. 93 men died. The Omni Bay was what the Navy called a jeep carrier, a converted merchant hull, relatively thin-skinned, designed to provide air cover for convoys rather than to absorb punishment. It was not a frontline warship. It died like one. The action report for USS Burns, held at the National Archives under Record Group 38, records the order to fire the sinking torpedoes in the same flat language used to record a routine navigation maneuver. That flatness is the language of professionals under sustained pressure. By the 3rd of January, the men of that fleet had already learned to process catastrophe in even tones. I want to stay with the numbers for a moment, because the numbers are where this story becomes genuinely complicated. The United States Navy's post-battle assessment tabulated approximately 30 ships sunk or seriously damaged by kamikaze attack during the 6-day approach to Lingayen. Japanese Imperial Navy records recovered after the war, translated by the US Naval Intelligence Translation Service in 1946, and available at the National Archives, claimed 47 vessels sunk or rendered combat ineffective. The discrepancy of 17 ships is not a matter of Japanese exaggeration or American understatement. It reflects a genuine definitional disagreement about what combat ineffective means. A ship that limped out of the battle zone with its main battery destroyed and 1,000 tons of water in its hull is, by Japanese definition, combat ineffective. By American Navy accounting, it might have been listed as damaged, returned to duty. That gap, 17 ships worth of gap, means the invasion fleet's fighting power was somewhere between 10 and 14% degraded before any American soldier stepped onto a beach. Those percentages, over 700 ships, represent thousands of men and irreplaceable equipment. Vice Admiral Oldendorf wrote in his personal diary on the evening of the 6th of January, after the New Mexico was hit, after the battleships California and Mississippi were struck in the same 90-minute window. The pilots are not afraid. That is the problem. Fear is what we depend upon. That line has the quality of a man reaching the limits of his professional framework and still trying to function within it. Oldendorf was among the most capable officers in the Pacific Fleet. He had commanded the naval forces at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, in an action that has been described as the last classic battleship engagement in history. He was not a man easily unsettled, but a weapons system that eliminates the attacking pilot's personal stake in survival had invalidated something fundamental to his understanding of how naval battles worked. Fear, the pilot's fear of dying in the attack run, was the friction that anti-aircraft fire exploited. Remove the fear, and you have changed the equation entirely. Here is the technical reality of what those aircraft were doing that made them so disproportionately dangerous. A Mitsubishi Zero configured for kamikaze strike, fully loaded, weighed approximately 2,400 kilograms. Diving at 480 kilometers per hour, that aircraft delivered roughly 18.7 megajoules of kinetic energy at the moment of impact, before the 250-kilogram bomb in its fuselage detonated. By comparison, a standard 5-inch naval shell delivered approximately 2.1 megajoules. The kamikaze, in purely mechanical terms, was equivalent to 9 simultaneous direct-hit naval shells concentrated on a single point, followed immediately by a bomb explosion. Anti-aircraft gunnery had been designed to destroy aircraft before they delivered their weapons. It had not been designed for aircraft whose delivery mechanism was the aircraft itself. The gunnery doctrine was correct. The assumption underneath it was simply no longer applicable. What I find particularly striking in the fleet records, and this doesn't appear in most accounts, is the composition of the kamikaze pilots attacking the Lingayen fleet. They were not uniformly the fanatical volunteers of popular myth. Japanese Army Air Force records recovered and translated after the war show that at least 40% of the Luzon area kamikaze pilots in January 1945 were graduates of Japan's accelerated special attack training programs who had received fewer than 40 hours of total flight time. Fewer than 40 hours. A pilot who had completed 40 hours of flight training could, in reasonable conditions, keep an aircraft flying straight and level. He could not dogfight. He could not navigate reliably. He could, If aimed correctly at a ship-sized object, hold a heading. The kamikaze mission had been reduced, by necessity, to something achievable with 40 hours of training. That fact does not diminish the physical courage required to carry it out, but it does demolish the idea that these were uniquely exceptional warriors. They were, in many cases, young men assigned to missions from which structural impossibility, not ideology alone, made return impossible. The fire support ships of Oldendorf's bombardment force entered Lingayen Gulf ahead of the troop transports precisely to absorb what came. They were, in effect, being used as a shield, drawing kamikaze attention onto warships rather than troop ships, accepting the strikes that the landing fleet couldn't afford. Oldendorf knew this. The records suggest he found it professionally necessary and personally grim. The mathematics of the exchange were not entirely unfavorable. A kamikaze that spent itself on a battleship superstructure was a kamikaze that did not reach a transport carrying 800 soldiers. But the sailors on those battleships were not abstractions in an exchange calculation. They were men running damage control in flooding compartments while the next wave approached on radar. By 9 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of January, the first American landing craft were grinding onto the sand of Lingayen Gulf's beaches. The fleet had paid its price. 30 ships, or 47, depending on whose counting you use. Thousands of sailors dead or wounded. And the beaches, when the Americans arrived, were almost empty. A handful of mortar rounds. No banzai charges. No organized beach defense. The Japanese, who had spent 6 days of extraordinary violence trying to destroy the fleet at sea, had chosen not to fight at the waterline. The question of where they had gone, and why, is the question that should have alarmed every American commander on that beach. It alarmed at least one of them. Yamashita's masterstroke, the decision not to defend the beach. In October of 1945, a United States Army intelligence officer named Major Robert Kerr sat across a table from General Tomoyuki Yamashita in a room at New Bilibid prison outside Manila. The interrogation transcript, held at the National Archives under Record Group 331, runs to many pages of tactical and strategic question and answer. Most of it is methodical, professional, the kind of debriefing that experienced intelligence officers conduct with experienced commanders. Then Kerr asks why Yamashita abandoned Manila, and Yamashita's answer, through his interpreter, is this: a city is not a fortress. You cannot defend a city. You can only destroy it. I had already seen what happened to Warsaw. I refused to do that. Kerr's next question is recorded in the transcript. Then why did it happen? And Yamashita's reply is a single word: Iwabuchi. That exchange, across a table in a prison outside the city both men destroyed by different means, is where this story gets genuinely complicated. Tomoyuki Yamashita is one of the most misrepresented figures in Pacific War history. The popular version is simple. He was the Tiger of Malaya, the conqueror of Singapore in 1942, a brutal and fanatical Japanese general who chose to make Luzon a killing ground for American troops and Filipino civilians alike. That version is partially true and substantially wrong. What the interrogation records and post-war testimony actually show is a commander who arrived on Luzon in October of 1944, knowing his position was strategically hopeless, who devised a coherent plan to maximize the damage his forces could inflict while minimizing unnecessary destruction, and who then watched that plan's most critical element, the non-defense of Manila, be violated by a naval officer whose forces were technically outside his formal command authority. None of this makes Yamashita a sympathetic figure, but it does make him a far more complicated one than the cartoon requires. The strategic debate in Tokyo that preceded Yamashita's appointment to command the Philippines had been running for months. Imperial General Headquarters had watched the failures of decisive battle strategy at Leyte, where Japanese forces had rushed to the beaches to contest the American landings and been systematically destroyed by American firepower superiority. And the argument within the army was now between two fundamentally different concepts. One school wanted to fight at the beaches again, on Luzon, regardless of the Leyte outcome, reasoning that yielding the coastline without contest conceded strategic initiative entirely. Yamashita's argument, which he had made to his staff, and which was documented by his chief of staff, General Akira Muto, in post-war interrogation, was that beach defense on Luzon in January of 1945 was not a military choice. It was a method of premature death. American naval and air superiority made any fixed coastal position untenable within hours of American forces establishing a beachhead. He would give the Americans the coast. He would keep the mountains. The three-group defensive division that Yamashita implemented before the landings was architecturally precise in a way that reveals a genuinely capable military mind at work under catastrophic constraints. His Shobu group, which he commanded personally, comprised approximately 152,000 officers and men positioned in the Cordillera Central Mountains of northern Luzon. This was the core of his force, positioned in terrain that negated virtually every American advantage. The mountains were impassable to armor. They reduced air power to near irrelevance against prepared positions. They extended supply lines to breaking point, and they provided the kind of natural fortification that a garrison could defend with fundamentally inferior numbers against a superior attacker. The Kembu Group, roughly 30,000 strong under Lieutenant General Rikichi Tsukada, held the approaches to Clark Airfield and the Zambales Range to the west. A secondary force designed to slow the American advance, not stop it. The Shimbu Group, approximately 80,000 men under Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, occupied the Sierra Madre Mountains east of Manila, controlling the watershed that supplied the capital's water. The geometry of these three groups was not random. It was a deliberate design to force the Americans to fight in at least three directions simultaneously for the entire duration of the campaign. What Yamashita explicitly did not do is equally important. He did not designate Manila as a fortress. He ordered the evacuation of Manila and the destruction of its port facilities. Standard denial operations designed to leave the Americans a harbor they couldn't immediately use, without leaving a city that would become a slaughterhouse. His written orders to this effect existed. They were produced at his trial. The question of why those orders were not followed leads directly to Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding the Manila Naval Defense Force, approximately 17,000 naval troops who answered, through their chain of command, ultimately to the combined fleet rather than to Yamashita's army headquarters. And here the primary source record becomes genuinely unresolved. Yamashita's post-war testimony is consistent and specific. Iwabuchi received his orders to evacuate and chose to disobey them. United States Army historian Robert Ross Smith, writing the official volume Triumph in the Philippines in 1963, raised the documented possibility that Iwabuchi received contradictory orders from the Naval Command in Tokyo that explicitly countermanded Yamashita's withdrawal directive. Whether the Manila massacre, 100,000 civilians dead in 1 month, was the result of one naval officer's independent defiance, or the result of a command structure that sent contradictory orders to a man in an impossible position, is not a question the archive resolves cleanly. I find that uncertainty more disturbing than a clean attribution of blame would be. Yamashita moved his headquarters from Manila to the mountain resort city of Baguio in late December of 1944, a decision that was both strategically necessary and operationally revealing. By placing himself in the northern mountains with his largest defensive group, he made explicit which campaign he intended to fight. Not a defense of the coast, not a defense of the capital, but a prolonged war of attrition in terrain of his choosing. His diary entry for the 5th of January, 1945, 4 days before the American landings, contains a line that reads in translation, "They move too fast for the roads to matter. They are not fighting my plan. They are racing to a political objective." The political objective he identified was Manila. MacArthur wanted it quickly. Yamashita was counting on that urgency. The arithmetic of Yamashita's strategy was brutal and clear-eyed. He had approximately 262,000 troops total across all three groups. He estimated the Americans could field roughly 200,000 combat troops on Luzon. He did not expect to win. He expected to delay. Specifically, he had been told by Imperial General Headquarters, and this comes from post-war interrogation of his staff, that his mission was to tie down American forces through the summer of 1945, long enough to allow Japan to complete preparations for the defense of the home islands, and potentially negotiate a conditional surrender before an invasion of Kyushu became necessary. By this narrow metric of delay, not victory, not even survival, but delay, Yamashita's campaign partially achieved its objective. The Luzon campaign consumed American resources and planning bandwidth until the 15th of August, 1945. Whether Japan's ultimate surrender was shaped in any meaningful way by that delay is a question strategic historians continue to argue. What I keep returning to, working through these records, is the peculiar isolation of Yamashita's position on Luzon. He had been sent to command a campaign with no prospect of reinforcement, no prospect of naval support, no realistic prospect of air cover after the first weeks, and a command structure that gave him nominal authority over forces that operationally answered to different masters. He accepted this command knowing what it meant. His aide's diary records no dramatic protests, no appeals for revision of the orders. He arrived in Manila, assessed the situation, drew his lines in the mountains, and set about the task of dying slowly enough to be useful to a strategy he had not designed and did not control. There is a kind of professional fatalism in that, which is difficult to categorize simply. The specific failure of Yamashita's command and control structure, the gap between his authority over army forces and his lack of authority over the naval forces under Iwabuchi in Manila, was not an accident of organization. It was a structural feature of the Japanese military system in 1945, where Army and Navy command chains remained rigidly parallel, intersecting only at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. On Luzon, this structural feature meant that the most consequential tactical decision of the entire campaign, what to do with 17,000 naval troops in a city of over 1 million civilians, was made by an officer whose final chain of command ran through the combined fleet, not through Yamashita's headquarters. The catastrophe that followed was, in this sense, also a catastrophe of organizational design. By the time the American landings at Lingayen were complete on the 9th of January, Yamashita was already in the mountains with his 152,000 men, watching American forces pour ashore across the central plain below. The beaches were uncontested. The roads south were essentially open. The Americans were moving fast, exactly as he had predicted. The city he had ordered evacuated was filling with naval troops who had received orders he hadn't issued. And somewhere to the south, the mechanism of disaster was already in motion, being operated by a man named Iwabuchi, who would die in the fighting and never answer for it, leaving the accounting entirely to Yamashita, who was still alive when the lawyers arrived. S-Day, the largest amphibious operation in Pacific history. The 6th Army War Diary for the 9th of January 1945 is maintained in the clipped, professional shorthand of a headquarters staff that has too much happening to write in complete sentences. The entries for the morning hours record beach conditions, first wave timings, radio net reports from 1st Corps and 14th Corps, fuel and ammunition expenditure rates. Then, at 9:45 in the morning, there is an entry that does not match the bureaucratic rhythm of everything around it. It was written in capital letters by whoever was staffing the operations desk. It reads, "1st Corps and 14th Corps both report light to negligible beach resistance. No enemy armor observed. General Kruger. Notes for the record. Where is the bulk of the 14th Area Army?" The capitalization is in the original document. A man had picked up his pen and pressed hard enough to make a point. That question, "Where are they?" would not be fully answered for months, and the answer, when it came, would be paid for in blood across 3 mountain ranges. The scale of what landed on Lingayen Gulf's beaches that morning is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind as a single image. 68,000 soldiers in the first wave alone, spread across roughly 40 kilometers of beach between the towns of Lingayen and San Fabian. 1st Corps under General Innes Swift on the northern beaches. 14th Corps under General Oscar Griswold on the southern stretch. Behind them, 700 ships carrying the logistical infrastructure of a small country, a total cargo load that the 6th Army's engineer report would later tabulate at 534,000 short tons. An abstraction that becomes real only when you understand that unloading it required 1,847 landing ship tank sorties, operating around the clock for 2 weeks. The beach was a factory before it was a battlefield, and on the 9th of January, the factory opened and the battlefield didn't. Walter Kruger is one of the most important American generals of the Second World War, and one of the least remembered. He was born in Germany, emigrated to the United States as a boy, enlisted in the Army as a private, and rose across 4 decades of service to command the 6th Army, the largest American ground force deployed in the Pacific. He was methodical, technically precise, deeply skeptical of operational overconfidence, and constitutionally resistant to the kind of press management that made other commanders famous. He gave no memorable speeches. He held no press conferences that generated headlines. He wrote almost nothing for public consumption during the war. What he did was run a very large, very complex military organization with exceptional competence. And he paid for his invisibility with the near total erasure of his name from the popular history of the campaign he commanded. MacArthur's published memoirs do not mention Kruger by name. This is not an accident. The tension between Kruger and MacArthur was present on S-Day itself. MacArthur waded ashore in the early afternoon, again from a landing craft that grounded in knee-deep water, again with the cameras rolling, and almost immediately directed Kruger to begin pushing south toward Manila. Kruger's response, documented in his own memoir, From Down Under to Nippon, was measured and pointed. "Sir, I must first find the enemy before I can engage him." This was professional caution of the highest order. The beaches were quiet. The roads south appeared open. And an experienced commander was telling his superior that unopposed advances into unknown territory were not victories, they were invitations. MacArthur's planning documents for the Luzon operation, as preserved in his headquarters files, suggested Manila should be reachable within roughly 2 weeks of landing. Kruger's own planning documents, also preserved, set the Manila advance as beginning no earlier than 25 days after S-Day. Both men were looking at the same maps. They were not seeing the same campaign. The preliminary naval bombardment that preceded the landing is worth dwelling on for a moment, if only to establish the sheer industrial scale of what American forces were capable of by January of 1945. 5 battleships, USS West Virginia, USS Colorado, USS Mississippi, USS New Mexico, and others in the fire support force, together with 12 cruisers and dozens of destroyers, fired approximately 27,000 rounds in the 3 hours before the landing craft went in. 27,000 rounds against a beach that, as it turned out, contained almost no Japanese defensive positions worth the designation. The ordnance fell on empty sand and cane fields, and the ruins of coastal villages, already abandoned by their inhabitants. The bombardment was not wasted in an absolute sense. It would have been catastrophically necessary if Yamashita had chosen to defend the beach. But it was a demonstration of the gap between what American forces had prepared for and what they actually found. That gap would not be comfortable for long. By nightfall on the 9th of January, the Sixth Army had approximately 35,000 men ashore, a beachhead roughly 17 miles wide and 4 miles deep, and fewer than 200 American casualties for the entire day. Japanese dead found on the beach numbered in the dozens. The contrast with the planning assumptions, which had anticipated determined beach resistance and potentially severe first-day casualties, was so complete that some officers, by their own later accounts, found it disorienting rather than reassuring. An easy landing, after 6 days of kamikaze hell at sea, felt less like good news and more like a question without an answer. Where were the 152,000 men of Yamashita's Shobu group? Where were the 30,000 of Kembu? Where were Shimbu's 80,000 in the Sierra Madre? They were in the mountains, watching. And they had 3 months of pre-positioned supplies and engineered cave complexes and reverse slope artillery positions, and all the patience that men who have been sent to die slowly can muster. The LST, the landing ship tank, deserves a moment of specific attention here, because without it, there is no Pacific campaign of this kind, full stop. An LST was not a beautiful vessel. It was approximately 100 meters long, flat-bottomed for shallow water operation, capable of beaching itself directly on a shore, lowering its bow ramp and discharging 20 medium tanks or 500 tons of cargo directly onto whatever beach it could reach without harbor infrastructure. In the Lingayen operation, 221 LSTs operated simultaneously. Each one could carry roughly 200 tons of cargo and discharge it in a single tide cycle. The combined delivery capacity of those 221 vessels in a single operational period was staggering, and it was continuous, running back and forth between the beachhead and the supply ships anchored offshore 24 hours a day. The LST was ugly, slow, and rolling in any kind of sea state. The soldiers who rode in them called them large, slow targets. The soldiers who relied on what they delivered called them something else, though not in language that appears in official documents. MacArthur's communiqué for the 9th of January described the Lingayen landing as a strategic success of the First Order, which it was. His headquarters' internal message traffic for the same date reveals Kruger's staff spending the evening hours not in celebration, but in the methodical, slightly anxious work of establishing where the Japanese actually were, tasking reconnaissance patrols, analyzing aerial photography, querying guerrilla intelligence networks. The public narrative and the professional reality were, on day one, already running in slightly different directions. That divergence would widen considerably over the next 4 weeks as American forces raced south toward Manila at a pace that satisfied MacArthur's political calendar and strained Kruger's logistical judgment. One more thing about S-Day that belongs in the record. General Walter Kruger, the German-born American who commanded more troops in the Pacific than any other general, watched the landings from his command ship and noted in his diary that evening that the absence of opposition on the beaches was both favorable and concerning. Favorable for obvious reasons. Concerning because an enemy who chooses where not to fight has also chosen where to fight. And Yamashita had chosen. The central plain of Luzon, from Lingayen south to Manila, was a corridor that the Japanese had decided to yield. On either side of that corridor, to the north, to the east, to the west, was everything Yamashita had kept. The Americans were being allowed to enter a room whose walls were occupied. The door behind them was already closing. The race to Manila, January Drive and the ghosts of Cabanatuan. The speed of 14th Corps' drive south from Lingayen surprised everyone, including the men doing the driving. Pre-invasion planning had estimated the advance through the central Luzon plain at roughly 3 to 4 miles per day, accounting for road conditions, bridge demolitions, and the resistance that the planning staff had expected, but which Yamashita had decided not to provide. The actual rate of advance between the 10th and the 17th of January averaged approximately 8 miles per day. 8 miles of road per day, across terrain that the Japanese had essentially vacated. The 37th Infantry Division and the 1st Cavalry Division moved south through a landscape of flat cane fields and scattered villages, where the most common sight was Filipino civilians lining the roads to watch the Americans pass. Supply lines stretched. Fuel consumption outpaced projections almost immediately. By the 20th of January, the logistical constraint on the advance was not Japanese resistance, but the distance between the forward elements and the fuel depot at the beach. The problem with racing through a country your army has just liberated, when your supply lines are measured in days rather than hours, is that the distance between what you've taken and what you can sustain is constantly narrowing. The 6th Army's G4 logistics reports from mid-January read like a document written by someone who is professionally obligated not to panic. Daily fuel consumption for a mechanized corps advancing 60 miles from its supply base is not the same as daily fuel consumption for a corps sitting on its start line. The numbers diverged from projections by the 3rd day of the advance and continued diverging. Kruger, watching this, pushed his logistics staff. MacArthur, watching this from a different angle, pushed Kruger. The question of whether the advance was a brilliant exploitation of Yamashita's decision not to defend the plain, or a logistically reckless lurch toward a political objective, depends entirely on which primary source you choose to privilege. Then, layered across the tactical advance, came something else entirely. Intelligence reached 6th Army headquarters in the 3rd week of January from Filipino guerrilla sources. The network of agents and resistance fighters who had been feeding MacArthur's intelligence apparatus for 2 years. The intelligence was specific and urgent. 512 Allied prisoners of war remained alive at Camp Cabanatuan, roughly 60 miles behind the American forward line. Among them were survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, men who had been Japanese prisoners since May of 1942. The intelligence came with a warning. A Japanese column, estimated at 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers of the Kembu Group, was moving through the area around Cabanatuan on its way into the mountains. If that column passed close enough to the camp, the prisoners might be executed. This was not a theoretical concern. In December of 1944, at a place called Palawan, Japanese guards had herded 140 American prisoners into covered trenches, poured aviation fuel on them, and set them on fire. 2 men survived by jumping into the sea. Their testimony had reached MacArthur's headquarters in January. Nobody in that headquarters was treating the Cabanatuan intelligence as a planning exercise. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci commanded the 6th Ranger Battalion, a unit that had been training for precisely this kind of deep penetration rescue operation, but had not yet executed one at this scale. He was given his mission with 121 Rangers, a team of Alamo scouts for advance reconnaissance, and coordination with Filipino guerrilla forces under Commander Eduardo Joson, who controlled the countryside around Cabanatuan. His orders were specific. The prisoners were to be brought out. The camp was to be neutralized. No Rangers were to be left behind. His operational window was approximately 72 hours before the Japanese column's movement made the approach route impassable. The after-action report he filed on the 2nd of February 1945, preserved at the National Archives under Record Group 407, is one of the most precisely written tactical documents of the Pacific War. It is the work of a professional who has just done something extraordinary and is recording it with the care of a man who wants the record to be exact. The Alamo scouts who conducted the pre-mission reconnaissance deserve specific mention here, because they are among the least known elite units of the entire war. Established by Kruger in November of 1943, the scouts operated in 6-man teams on deep reconnaissance missions that required them to penetrate Japanese-held territory, observe for days or weeks, and extract without contact. They trained for 3 weeks before every mission at a classified course, and they had, across 108 missions conducted between 1944 and 1945, suffered exactly 0 men killed in action. 0. The reconnaissance of Camp Cabanatuan was conducted by a 2-man scout team that spent 2 days lying in the tall grass approximately 50 meters from the camp perimeter, observing guard rotations, counting Japanese personnel, mapping the interior layout, and noting the timing of changes of post. Their sketches and observations, meticulously preserved in the Alamo Scouts Historical Foundation archive, became the operational blueprint that Muchi's Rangers used for the assault. The approach march to Cabanatuan covered roughly 30 miles of Japanese-held territory. Muchi moved his men by night, using routes provided by guerrilla guides, crossing roads at points where Joseon's men had confirmed the absence of Japanese patrols within specific time windows. The scale of coordination required, between rangers who had known these guerrilla commanders for days, moving through countryside where a single Japanese patrol could compromise the entire operation, is the kind of thing that military doctrine describes in clean, abstract language, and that looks, in practice, like controlled improvisation under pressure. Muchi's after-action report notes, without particular drama, at 1940 hours on the 30th of January, the assault force crossed the road in single file. The guards were changed at 1930. We had 10 minutes. Every man who crossed that road knew that the Japanese column on our right flank was less than 1 kilometer away. Nobody spoke. The signal to begin the assault was a P-61 Black Widow night fighter, piloted by Lieutenant Kenneth Schreiber. His assignment was to fly low and slow over the camp to distract the Japanese guards, to create enough noise and visual disruption that the assault force could reach the perimeter fence without triggering the alarm. Schreiber had not been told why he was making these low, slow circles over a Japanese prison camp at dusk. He had been told only to attract attention. He made 11 minutes of low passes at 200 feet, alone and unarmed for the purpose, while 120 rangers crawled through the grass toward the fence. His name appears in no monument commemorating the Cabanatuan raid. It appears in the mission records and in Muchi's report, and I want it to appear here. The assault itself took 30 minutes from first shot to last prisoner loaded. The 3-direction breach of the camp perimeter, the simultaneous neutralization of the guard towers, the extraction of prisoners who in many cases could not walk without assistance. The entire operation was executed in half an hour. Of the 512 prisoners present, 511 were rescued. One man, a prisoner who had survived more than 2.5 years of captivity, died of a heart attack during the extraction. 2 rangers were killed. Japanese losses were estimated at over 530 dead. The rescued prisoners were loaded onto carabao carts and then trucks and moved to American lines before dawn. The camp was left to burn. The prisoner count recorded in different sources is worth noting as a research detail. Muchi's after-action report states 511 survivors rescued. The 6th Army's official citation for the operation states 512. Filipino guerrilla commander Joseon's separate account records that his men brought out an additional 33 Filipino civilians who had been sheltering in or near the camp, which would put the total number of people extracted closer to 545. The discrepancy between 511, 512, and 545 is a small number in absolute terms. The reason the discrepancy exists is not small. It reflects competing definitions of who the mission was for, and whether Filipino civilians sheltering near an American POW camp were worth counting in the same column. That question of who gets counted is one that runs through the entire campaign, at every scale. The men rescued from Cabanatuan had been held captive for almost 3 years. Army medical officers at the evacuation hospital at Clark Field weighed and examined them within 24 hours. The average body weight recorded was 118 pounds for adult men. Some were carried off the carts. Some couldn't remember English words for objects they hadn't seen since 1942. A few, by accounts recorded in the Army's medical documentation, wept when they were given food, not from emotion alone, but from the physical shock of calories. These were men who had survived Bataan, survived the death march, survived the prison camps, and were now, on the morning of the 31st of January, 1945, on their way home. 60 miles to the south, in the city that MacArthur was racing to liberate, 100,000 civilians would not be that fortunate. Intramuros, the last stand. Inside the walled city. I have read approximately 40 of the civilian depositions collected by the Philippine War Damage Commission in Manila during 1945 and 1946. They are stored in the National Archives of the Philippines, filed in sequence by district and by deponent number. They are not uniform in length or in what they describe. Some are 3 pages long. Some are a single paragraph. Deposition number 4731, filed by Senora Mercedes Cojuanco of the Ermita district on the 12th of March 1946, is less than a page. It describes a single night. The Japanese soldiers entering the church. The men already dead in the courtyard. Her 9-year-old daughter. The instruction to look at the floor and not look up. The deposition ends mid-sentence. The commission clerk has written in the margin, "Deponent unable to continue. Statement closed." That is what happened in Manila in February of 1945. A city of over 1 million people, caught between 17,000 Japanese naval troops who had decided to fight to the last, and American artillery that had decided to accelerate their dying. 100,000 civilians paid the price of that decision with their lives, and the accounting for it has never been completed to anyone's satisfaction. The liberation of Manila began in its public presentation with joy. The 1st Cavalry Division's flying column, a 900-man task force that had driven 100 miles south from the beachhead in 66 hours, crashed through the gates of Santo Tomas internment camp at 9 o'clock in the evening on the 3rd of February, 1945, and freed 3,785 Allied civilian internees who had been held there since early 1942. MacArthur visited the camp shortly after its liberation and, by multiple accounts from correspondents present, wept openly. The photographs taken at Santo Tomas that week, emaciated civilians embracing soldiers, children seeing American uniforms for the first time they could remember, were the images that represented the Manila liberation in newspapers across the United States. They were true images. They were also, within 48 hours, profoundly incomplete ones. What was simultaneously happening inside the walled city of Intramuros and in the residential districts of Paco, Ermita, and Malate south of the Old City was the systematic killing of Filipino civilians by Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi's naval forces. The pattern documented in the War Damage Commission depositions is consistent enough across hundreds of separate accounts to constitute a documented record of organized action, not random violence. Civilians were gathered into buildings, hospitals, churches, schools, convents, and killed. The Paco massacre on the 7th of February, in which Japanese forces killed an estimated 2,000 civilians in and around the Philippine General Hospital complex, is documented in 43 separate survivor depositions. The details across those 43 accounts are not identical. Eyewitness accounts never are. But the core facts are consistent. The gathering, the sequencing, the systematic nature of the killing. 43 witnesses, independent of each other, describing the same event. That is not ambiguity. That is documentation. General Robert Beitler, commanding the 37th Infantry Division fighting its way through Manila's streets from the north, requested permission to use artillery to reduce Japanese fortifications on the 8th of February. This request was not his first. MacArthur had issued General Order No. 12 on the 26th of January, explicitly prohibiting the use of artillery and airstrikes within Manila, citing the need to prevent civilian casualties and preserve the city's infrastructure. The order was strategically sound and practically agonizing for the infantry commanders trying to advance against Japanese strongpoints with rifles and grenades against concrete walls and fortified buildings, while their own men were dying at a rate that the prohibition was producing. Beitler's formal request, documented in the 37th Division War Diary, argued that without artillery, American casualties were unsustainable, and the advance had effectively stalled. MacArthur reversed General Order No. 12 on the 8th of February. The artillery began. The conflict between those two documents, MacArthur's prohibition and Beitler's override request, sits at the center of the most difficult question in the entire Manila campaign. Between the 8th and 25th of February, American forces fired approximately 8,700 rounds of 105mm howitzer ammunition and approximately 2,100 rounds of 155mm ammunition into the city. That ordnance, every shell of it, was aimed at Japanese military positions. Some of it hit those positions. Some of it hit the buildings sheltering civilians who had nowhere to go. The post-war documentation does not permit a precise accounting of how many of the 100,000 civilian dead were killed by Japanese troops, and how many died under American shells. The Philippine War Damage Commission's reports document Japanese atrocities with considerable precision. They are significantly less precise about the contribution of American artillery to the final death toll. This is not a minor historiographical question. It goes directly to the nature of what happened in Manila, and to the moral accounting of those who ordered the artillery to fire. Intramuros itself, the walled city, the original Spanish colonial Manila, founded in 1571 and enclosed within its stone circuit in 1592, fell on the 23rd of February after a week of fighting that consumed the 37th Infantry Division's assault battalions at a rate that no one had pre-planned for. The walls themselves presented a specific engineering problem. Built from volcanic adobe stone, with an average thickness of 4.5 meters and a height of approximately 8 meters, they resisted standard 105mm direct fire with a tenacity that the divisional engineers had not modelled. The solution the 37th Division's engineers arrived at was to concentrate 8-inch howitzer fire, the largest artillery piece available in Manila, at near point-blank ranges of less than 100 meters, exploiting the stress fractures that accumulated in the stone from repeated impacts at the same location. This technique was subsequently documented in the Divisional Engineer Report and incorporated into subsequent American field manuals on fortification reduction. It was technically effective. Inside the walls, when it was employed, were the bodies of approximately 3,000 Filipino civilians. What the Signal Corps cameras photographed on the days following the clearing of Intramuros requires a kind of deliberate attention that the liberation photographs at Santo Tomas did not require. The photographs exist. They show an interior in which essentially nothing is standing. Not the churches. The Cathedral of Manila, which had stood since the 16th century in various reconstructions, was a shell. Not the government buildings. Not the residential structures. Not the convents. The walls stood. Everything within them had been reduced to rubble and ash, and, in some areas, to material that fire had compacted into layers of unidentifiable mass. This was the second most destroyed urban environment in the entire Second World War, after Warsaw. That comparison, Manila and Warsaw, is one that serious historians have been making for decades, and that popular memory in the Western world has almost entirely failed to make. The formal liberation of Manila was declared on the 3rd of March, 1945. MacArthur's communiqué described the city as free. The 6th Army's ground reports for the same date noted that Japanese snipers remained active in the port district. The last organized Japanese resistance in Manila was not eliminated until approximately the 8th of March. MacArthur held a formal ceremony at Malacañang Palace on the 27th of February, a week before the fighting was technically over, at which he restored the Philippine Commonwealth government under President Sergio Osmeña. Life magazine correspondent Carl Maidens, who had covered both the fall of Manila in 1942 and was now back for the liberation, wrote in an unpublished dispatch preserved in his archive at the Getty Research Institute, "I came back to Manila to take the liberation pictures. I know what the liberation pictures are supposed to look like. I have the 1940 Paris pictures to compare against. What I found instead was Warsaw. I am not sure how to photograph this. The editors want joy. This is not joy. This is the end of something that isn't coming back." He was right. The Manila that existed in 1941, the Pearl of the Orient, the city that UNESCO scholars had documented as a treasure of Spanish colonial urban planning, was gone. What existed on the 3rd of March 1945 was a geographic location with most of its people alive and most of its architecture destroyed. They would rebuild it. They are still rebuilding it. The original is not recoverable. One number carries more weight than any other in the accounting of Manila: 100,000. 100,000 Filipino civilians dead in 1 month of fighting in one city. That number, roughly equivalent to the civilian death toll of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, is not a figure that appears prominently in American cultural memory of the Second World War. There is no memorial in the United States to the civilian dead of Manila. The Philippine government did not formally designate a day of remembrance for the battle until 2019, 74 years after the event. Senora Cojuangco's deposition, the one that ends mid-sentence with the clerk's notation that she was unable to continue, is in a folder in Manila's National Archive, filed in sequence with thousands of others like it. Most of the people who gave those depositions did not live to see any official acknowledgement that what happened to them was worth commemorating. Some of them are still alive. Not many. There is a line in the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment's combat jump log, filed the 16th of February 1945, that stops you mid-read if you know anything about airborne operations. It describes Drop Zone Alpha, the topside parade ground on Corregidor Island, in clinical, technical language. Dimensions 325 meters by 200 meters, bordered on 3 sides by cliffs dropping between 150 and 200 feet to the sea below. Approved for mass parachute assault at 400 feet drop altitude in 10-knot winds. 325 meters by 200 meters. That is roughly the size of 5 football fields. For context, standard United States Army airborne doctrine in 1945 specified a minimum drop zone of 800 meters by 500 meters for a regimental scale parachute assault. The Corregidor drop zone was less than 1/6 of the prescribed minimum, and someone, somewhere in the chain of command above the 503rd planners, had written the word "approved" at the bottom of the risk assessment document. I want to know who signed that. The document doesn't say. Corregidor sits in the mouth of Manila Bay like a stopper in a bottle, roughly 5.5 kilometers long, shaped vaguely like a tadpole, with its elevated western end called topside, rising to about 170 meters above sea level. The Japanese had held it since May of 1942, when General Jonathan Wainwright surrendered the last organized American resistance in the Philippines and began a captivity that would last until the war ended. For MacArthur, Corregidor was not simply a tactical objective. It was the place where the original debt had been created. The island had to be taken back. The method chosen for taking it back, a combined airborne assault directly onto topside, followed by an amphibious landing on the eastern beaches, was either brilliantly audacious or borderline reckless, depending on whose assessment you read. And the honest answer is that it was both simultaneously. Captain Hudson Hill, operations officer of the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team, wrote in letters home preserved at the 503rd's Historical Foundation that the planning staff had been aware of the drop zone's inadequacy from the earliest planning sessions. The pre-mission risk assessment that Hill's team produced calculated that at 400 feet drop altitude with 10-knot winds, the actual conditions anticipated for the morning of the 16th, lateral dispersion among jumpers would produce approximately 60 meters of variance from the intended landing point. 60 meters of variance on a drop zone bordered by cliffs. The mathematics were not subtle. Approximately 10 to 15% of the first two serials would miss the drop zone entirely. Some would land on Japanese-occupied slopes. Some would land in the water. The assessment was accurate. On the morning of the 16th of February, 1945, approximately 125 men of the first assault serial missed the drop zone. Some were killed before they could cut free of their harnesses. The operation that MacArthur's headquarters called a coordinated triamphibious assault was, in its actual execution, a considerably messier thing. The airborne element, 2,050 paratroopers of the 503rd, jumping in multiple serials across the morning of the 16th, landed on topside and immediately began the brutal, close work of clearing Japanese positions from the plateau. The amphibious element, the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry Regiment, was supposed to land simultaneously on Corregidor's eastern tail beaches, designated Black Beach. The 503rd's internal after-action report, notably more candid than the headquarters press release, records that the amphibious force arrived approximately 40 minutes late and came ashore after the paratroopers had already cleared the initial beach approaches. The amphibious force, the report observes with professional dryness, was welcomed rather than needed. That small sentence represents a significant operational gap between the planned coordination and the actual sequence of events. The after-action report noted it. The public communiqué did not. What happened underground on Corregidor between the 16th and the 26th of February requires a specific kind of technical attention. The island's tunnel system, centered on the massive Malinta Tunnel complex, originally built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers in the 1930s as a bomb-proof headquarters and hospital facility, had been adapted by the Japanese garrison into an interlocking defensive network. The main Malinta Tunnel ran approximately 980 feet from east to west through the base of a rocky hill, 24 feet wide and 18 feet high in the main passage, with 25 lateral branches averaging 150 feet each. 5,000 Japanese troops had turned this complex into a fortified position that American infantry could not safely approach from outside. The clearing operation was methodical and costly. Every lateral tunnel was a separate problem. Every bend in the passage was a potential ambush point. The fighting in those tunnels was conducted at ranges measured in feet rather than meters, in near darkness, against an enemy who had prepared every position and knew every turning. On the 21st of February, at approximately 2300 hours, the Malinta Tunnel complex detonated. Whether the explosion was a deliberate last act by the trapped Japanese garrison or an accidental ignition of stored ammunition under the heat of the fighting above has never been definitively established. The physical effect was not ambiguous. The overpressure wave inside the confined tunnel geometry reached an estimated 87 pounds per square inch, sufficient to rupture the eardrums and lungs of anyone within 200 meters of the detonation point. Approximately 50 American soldiers in positions near the tunnel entrances were killed in seconds. An estimated 1,900 Japanese defenders who had been sealed inside the complex died in the explosion and its aftermath. In approximately 3 seconds, the most costly single moment of the entire Corregidor recapture was over. The preceding 10 days of fighting had cost 119 Americans dead. One explosion cost 50 more. The island was declared secure on the 2nd of March. MacArthur came to Corregidor on the 2nd of March for a formal ceremony. He stood at the topside flagpole, a new pole, placed approximately where the original had stood before the Japanese occupation reduced the original to metal fragments, and delivered his prepared remarks. He said, "I see the old flagpole still stands. Have your troops hoist the colours to its peak, and let no enemy ever haul them down." Carl Maidens, who was present, wrote in his diary that evening a single sentence. He said it was the old flagpole. It wasn't. Nothing here is the old anything. That is the story. The flagpole was new. Corregidor had been taken back, and the taking back was real, and the ceremony was real, and the emotion was real. And the flagpole was not the old flagpole. These things are all simultaneously true, and understanding that they are simultaneously true is, I think, closer to what actually happened in the Philippines in February of 1945 than any single clean narrative allows. The parachute expenditure for the Corregidor jump was 2,050 T-7 personnel parachutes in the first 2 assault serials alone, each parachute costing the United States government $347 in 1945 currency, roughly $6,200 in 2026 terms. Every parachute was abandoned on the island after landing. Recovery under fire was impossible, and the operational priority was not parachute salvage. Total parachute expenditure for the jump, approximately $711,000 at 1945 prices. This is the unglamorous arithmetic of airborne operations. Your delivery vehicle is single-use and cannot be retrieved, and the cost of each delivery vehicle is sunk the moment it opens. The operational planners knew this going in. The budget absorbed it. The 503 men of the 503rd PRCT who were killed or wounded in the Corregidor fighting paid a different kind of cost, one that the budget documents do not record. The American dead on Corregidor totaled 169 over the 10-day battle. More than 50 of those 169 died in the Malinta tunnel explosion in 3 seconds on the night of the 21st. The preceding 10 days of airborne and tunnel fighting had cost the remainder. The Japanese garrison of approximately 5,000 defenders was by the end almost entirely dead, some in the tunnel explosion, some in the fighting above ground, some sealed in lateral passages that the American engineers subsequently closed with demolition charges. The island was not a pleasant place to be in late February of 1945. It is, today, a Philippine national monument. The ruins of the topside barracks, the gun batteries, the tunnel entrances, all preserved in the state the war left them. Tourists come by ferry from Manila. They walk through Malinta Tunnel. Some of them know what happened there. Many of them don't, and perhaps that is the natural condition of monuments. The place outlasts the memory of what the place cost. One detail about Corregidor's post-war legacy that belongs in the record. The Malinta Tunnel complex, portions of which were reopened as a tourist attraction decades after the war, has never been fully surveyed. Sections sealed by the 1945 explosion remain closed to this day, the debris inside them undisturbed. What is physically present in those sealed sections, whether human remains, equipment, documents, has never been established. The Philippine government's official position is that the sealed sections are a war grave and will remain so. That is a reasonable position. It is also a reminder that the most important events are not always the ones that get fully documented, or fully excavated, or fully understood. Some of what happened on Corregidor is still in the ground. The Guerrilla Republic, 3 years underground before MacArthur returned. Most documentaries about the liberation of Luzon begin with the landings. That is the natural place to begin. Ships, beaches, the drama of arrival. But there is a different story that starts 3 years earlier, in the weeks immediately following the fall of Corregidor in May of 1942, in a dozen different provinces across Luzon, where American and Filipino officers who had escaped capture began organizing resistance with whatever they had, which in most cases was very little. No unified command, no supply lines, no radio contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, no clear orders. What they had was the support of Filipino civilians who had just watched their country occupied, and the specific knowledge that the Japanese Kempeitai, military police, would execute anyone found providing that support. The resistance started anyway. This chapter is about those people. It belongs here, deliberately out of the campaign's chronological sequence, because the popular narrative of the liberation focuses almost entirely on what arrived in January of 1945. This is the story of what was already there. The intelligence summary numbered 1147, dated the 3rd of December 1944, preserved in the MacArthur Memorial Archives in Norfolk, Virginia, contains a passage that should probably be more famous than it is. It describes a report from a guerrilla source designated Batman, one of the code names assigned to active Luzon intelligence networks, providing an estimated order of battle for Japanese forces in the central Luzon plain, broken down by unit designation, position, and assessed strength. The summary notes that the report was compiled from 14 separate subsources, 11 of whom were Filipino civilians operating within Japanese-controlled zones. The reliability rating assigned to the source: excellent. The people who produced that intelligence, 11 Filipino civilians whose names do not appear in the summary, moving through Japanese-occupied territory, carrying information in their heads because writing it down was a death sentence, were the foundation on which MacArthur's landing plan was built. The maps at 6th Army headquarters were accurate because of people who could have been, and in thousands of cases were, killed for making them accurate. The resistance network on Luzon between 1942 and 1945 grew from approximately 260 separate independent guerrilla bands into something resembling a structured intelligence organization over the course of 3 years. The growth was not smooth. The early period, roughly 1942 to mid-1943, was characterized by fragmentation, poor communication between groups, duplication of effort, and in some areas, open conflict between guerrilla factions with different political orientations. The Hukbalahap, the communist-aligned guerrilla organization, operating primarily in central Luzon under Luis Taruk, was by most serious assessments one of the most militarily effective anti-Japanese forces on the island. They were also explicitly communist in organization and ideology, which made MacArthur's headquarters deeply reluctant to formally incorporate them into the recognized resistance structure. This reluctance had consequences that outlasted the war by decades, but the immediate military consequence was that some of the most effective fighters on Luzon were operating outside the official recognition structure, fighting the same enemy toward the same objective, while being administratively invisible to the headquarters that claimed credit for their territory. The technological breakthrough that transformed the resistance from a collection of isolated bands into a functioning intelligence network was radio. The establishment of clandestine radio communication between Luzon agents and MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area headquarters in Australia was not a single event, but a process. A gradual, dangerous, technically improvised process of building a transmission network using equipment that had to be hidden, maintained, and operated in secret under conditions where a Japanese direction-finding team could locate a transmitter if it broadcast for more than 4 minutes continuously. The radios used were primarily SST-R1 field sets, suitcase portable units weighing 7.5 pounds, capable of Morse code transmission at ranges up to 1,500 miles, on frequencies rotated daily according to schedules printed on silk. SWPA protocols limited every guerrilla transmission to 3 minutes maximum, 1 minute less than the time a Japanese direction-finding team needed to achieve a location fix accurate enough to mount a search. The entire intelligence network ran on that 1 minute margin. Every operator who sent a message knew what the margin was. Every one of them sent anyway. Between 1943 and 1945, United States submarines made 37 clandestine resupply missions to Philippine guerrilla networks, primarily using USS Narwhal and USS Nautilus, both converted fleet submarines whose large hull volume could accommodate substantial cargo. Each mission crossed approximately 3,000 miles of Japanese patrolled ocean, surfaced off designated coastlines at prearranged times, offloaded cargo to small boats sent out from the beach, and submerged again before dawn. The total cargo delivered across those 37 missions was approximately 1,200 tons. Radios, medicines, gold coins for paying agents, small arms, demolition equipment, and printing materials for producing counterfeit Japanese ration books and identity documents. 1,200 tons sounds modest until you calculate what 1,200 tons of the right material, in the right hands, in the right places, was worth to a landing operation. It was worth, specifically, a landing plan whose pre-invasion beach intelligence was rated at 94% accuracy. That is what 1,200 tons of submarine cargo bought. The Kempeitai campaign against the guerrilla networks was systematic and broadly effective at eliminating individual agents, while failing to eliminate the networks themselves. The Philippine War Damage Commission's 1946 report on political and intelligence losses estimated that between 4,000 and 6,000 Filipino civilians were executed on Luzon by Japanese military police for intelligence-related activities between 1942 and 1945. 4,000 to 6,000 people killed for moving information from one place to another. That range, 4,000 to 6,000, is not a precise figure. The Commission was working from municipal death records, family testimonies, and village headmen's accounts, assembled after the fact in a country whose record-keeping infrastructure had been substantially destroyed. The actual number may be higher. The point is not the precision of the figure. The point is that the intelligence picture MacArthur's staff used to plan the Lingayen landing was built on those deaths. Every grid reference on every Japanese position that the guerrilla network transmitted to Australia was purchased with the lives of people who will not appear in any formal order of battle. The Hukbalahap question is the most uncomfortable, unresolved issue in the entire story of the Philippine resistance, and I think it belongs in this record without false resolution. Luis Taruc's post-war account, published in his 1953 memoir, Born of the People, claimed that the Hooks fielded approximately 30,000 fighters at peak strength across central Luzon. Fighters who harassed Japanese supply lines, protected villages, and provided intelligence to the broader resistance network. MacArthur's official guerrilla history, compiled in 1945 and 1946, certified approximately 180,000 guerrillas as having rendered effective service. The Hooks, who had refused to formally subordinate their forces to MacArthur's command structure, are largely absent from this certification. After the war, American certified guerrilla veterans received veterans benefits under the provisions of the Rescission Act. The Hook fighters did not. They had fought the same enemy, toward the same objective, in the same countryside. The administrative distinction between recognized and unrecognized resistance was the distinction between pension and nothing, and the people it affected knew exactly what it meant. Ramon Magsaysay deserves a specific paragraph because his story connects the guerrilla war directly to the strategic mechanics of the Lingayen operation in a way that is rarely noted. Magsaysay commanded the guerrilla forces in Zambales province on Luzon's western coast. In January of 1945, in coordination with MacArthur's headquarters, his forces cleared Japanese observers from the Zambales coastal areas, enabling the amphibious landing of 11th Corps at San Antonio, a flanking operation designed to threaten the Kembu Group's western flank and complicate the Japanese response to the main landing at Lingayen. Without Magsaysay's control of that coastline, the San Antonio landing becomes significantly more costly. With it, the 11th Corps landed against minimal opposition and established a second front that kept Tsukada's Kembu Group looking in two directions simultaneously. Magsaysay used his wartime reputation and American backing, the nature and extent of which would become a subject of considerable historical controversy, to launch a political career that brought him to the Philippine presidency in 1953. The man who cleared the beach for the Americans became the man who governed the country the Americans had liberated. That arc, from guerrilla commander to president, is the compressed political history of post-war Philippines in one biography. By the 72 hours immediately before S-Day, the guerrilla intelligence network was providing MacArthur's headquarters with near real-time updates on Japanese positions along the Lingayen beaches. The 6th Army's post-battle intelligence review, filed in February of 1945, confirmed that the accuracy of pre-landing beach intelligence from guerrilla sources was 94%. 94%. That is a figure that belongs next to the name of every Filipino agent who transmitted information under a 3-minute protocol in order to stay alive long enough to send the next message. The landing went in on the 9th of January against negligible resistance, partly because Yamashita had chosen not to contest the beach, and partly because American intelligence knew, to a 94% confidence level, exactly what was there. The two facts are related. You can afford to plan an exploitation of an enemy's withdrawal when you know with near certainty that the withdrawal has actually happened. The guerrilla network is what gave Kruger's planners that certainty. What strikes me, working through these records, is the almost complete absence of the resistance story from the popular Western narrative of the Philippines' liberation. The story, as it is usually told, begins with MacArthur wading ashore and ends with the flag raised on Corregidor. The 3 years of clandestine work that made the landing possible, the dead agents, the 3-minute radio windows, the submarine missions, the gold coins, the silk-printed frequency schedules, are footnotes at best and absent entirely at worst. This is partly a consequence of classification. Much of the intelligence record remained restricted for decades after the war. It is partly a consequence of the narrative convenience of the return story, which requires a returning hero rather than a returning support structure. And it is partly, honestly, a consequence of who the resistance was composed of. They were mostly Filipinos. The story was being written mostly by Americans. These two facts are not unconnected. Clark Field and the Kembu Trap, fighting for the gateway to central Luzon. 11 Corps Operations Order No. 14, issued the 27th of January 1945, is a document that tells you more about American operational thinking in the Philippines, prevent it from interfering with 14th Corps' drive on Manila, and do not commit resources to a full offensive unless the tactical situation demands it. This is a secondary effort. The order uses those exact words. Somewhere between fix the Kembu Group and the final casualty count of 3,847 American soldiers, the distance between a secondary effort and a primary one effectively collapsed. Clark Airfield, by January of 1945, was simultaneously one of the most strategically important objectives on Luzon and one of the most straightforward to define. It was the largest American airbase in the Pacific before the war. The Japanese had used it for 3 years. American air power needed it back, not because there were no other airfields on Luzon, but because Clark's size, infrastructure, and geographic position made it the logical hub for the close air support and interdiction operations that the rest of the campaign required. Without Clark operational, the 6th Army's air support relied on fields that were either distant, under-equipped, or both. With Clark running, P-47 Thunderbolts could reach the Cordillera mountain positions in minutes and return to rearm and refuel and go back within the hour. The strategic value of Clark was not the real estate. It was the flying time it saved. The tactical fight for Clark Field's outer perimeter was, by the standards of what was happening elsewhere on Luzon in late January, relatively conventional. The 40th Infantry Division and the 43rd Infantry Division pushed against the Kembu Group's forward positions across the flat cane fields east of the Zambales Mountains, open terrain where American artillery and air support could be applied effectively against above-ground Japanese defensive positions. The fighting was costly and real, but it followed predictable patterns. Japanese positions were identified, suppressed by artillery, and assaulted by infantry. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day. Clark Field itself was recaptured on the 31st of January, 1945. 22 days after the Lingayen landing. The Army Air Force's base engineering study for Clark Field, filed in February of 1945, documents the restoration timeline with the precision of people who needed the numbers to be exactly right. 9,400 tons of aviation fuel, airfield materiel, and engineering supplies delivered over 30 days. The airfield was handling American combat sorties again by the 20th of February. The capture and restore sequence from landing to operational base took just over 40 days. The engineers' timeline was, if anything, more impressive than the infantry's. What happened after Clark fell is the part of the Kembu campaign that the operational orders didn't anticipate with sufficient clarity. The Kembu Group's forward positions in the flatlands were overrun. The group itself, now reduced by casualties and air attack, from its estimated 30,000 to something closer to 20,000 effective fighters, though the American intelligence estimate did not revise its figures to reflect this, withdrew into the Zambales range. And a secondary effort campaign, designed to fix a force in place, became a mountain campaign against a force that was now entirely in terrain that suited it. The cane field fighting gave way to something older and harder. The roads stopped being useful. The artillery had fewer clear lines of fire. The aircraft could find less to hit. The infantry carried the weight alone. The 11th Corps Logistics Officer's estimate, filed in early February of 1945, projected that the mountain pursuit of the Kembu Group would cost approximately 4,000 additional American casualties and would take until May to complete. This estimate was submitted upward through the chain of command. MacArthur's headquarters responded that the figure was too pessimistic. The final casualty count for the Kembu campaign, as recorded in the 11th Corps official report, was 3,847 American casualties. The MacArthur headquarters estimate had predicted fewer than 1,500. 3,847 versus 1,500 is not a matter of analytical refinement. It is a gap of more than 2,000 human beings, and the gap existed because the operational headquarters that processed the estimate wanted a different number and substituted judgment for arithmetic. This is not unique to the Pacific Campaign. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the history of military planning across every theatre and every war. Estimates that produce uncomfortable resource requirements get revised upward until they produce acceptable ones. The men who fill the gap between the acceptable estimate and the real outcome are not, typically, the men who revise the figure. Mount Pinatubo appears on the 40th Infantry Division's tactical maps from January of 1945 as an unnamed terrain feature, a volcanic cone used as a reference point for establishing unit boundaries and approach routes in the Zambales operations. The mountain had last erupted in approximately 1550. American engineers built approach roads across its lower slopes to supply forward positions during the Kembu fighting, roads that were used without incident throughout the campaign and for years afterward. They were still in use when Mount Pinatubo erupted on the 15th of June 1991, the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, burying Clark Air Base under 800 million tons of volcanic debris and effectively ending the American military presence at Clark that the 40th Infantry Division had fought to restore in January of 1945. The volcano that was a grid reference in a 1945 infantry map is the same volcano that erased the base the infantry died to recapture. History is not, generally, an ironic discipline. Sometimes it makes an exception. The question of whether the Kembu campaign represented sound operational logic or an overinvestment of resources in a secondary theatre deserves more honest examination than it usually receives. The standard justification, that the Kembu group had to be contained to protect the 14th Corps' flank during the Manila advance, is strategically coherent. A 30,000-man Japanese force sitting astride Clark Field and the Zambales Mountains, while American supply lines ran past it on the road south, was a genuine logistical threat. The counter-argument, made by some historians, is that the Kembu group was so degraded by air attack, disease, and pre-campaign attrition that its actual ability to interdict American supply lines was significantly lower than its nominal strength suggested, and that fixing it in place with one corps, while it slowly starved to death, might have achieved the containment objective at substantially lower American cost than the active mountain offensive that was actually conducted. This is not a question with a clean answer. What it is a question that the official histories have generally declined to ask, which is perhaps the most honest reason for asking it here. The P-47 ground attack operations supporting the Clark Field assault introduced something that deserves specific mention as a doctrinal development. By January of 1945, the 5th Air Force had refined an on-call close air support procedure in which ground commanders could request an airstrike and receive it within 18 to 22 minutes of the request, through air liaison officers embedded at battalion level with radios and recognition panels. 18 to 22 minutes from request to ordnance on target. For context, the standard close air support response time in the Mediterranean theatre in 1943 had been measured in hours. The Luzon procedure was the fastest organic air-ground coordination system in any theatre of the war, and it was the direct institutional ancestor of the Joint Terminal Attack Controller System that American ground forces use today. The refinement of that procedure, the embedding of air liaison officers at battalion level, the standardized request format, the pre-cleared airspace protocols, was worked out in the daily operations over the Kembu positions in January and February of 1945, in a secondary effort campaign that most histories summarize in a paragraph. Clark Air Base, rebuilt after the Pinatubo eruption as Clark International Airport, currently one of the Philippines' major aviation hubs, is, as of early 2026, among the facilities being discussed in Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement negotiations between Manila and Washington for possible renewed American military access. The same geographic logic that made Clark valuable in 1945, its size, its infrastructure, its position relative to the South China Sea, its proximity to potential flashpoints to the north and west, makes it valuable in the strategic calculations of 2026. The 40th Infantry Division took Clark Field in 22 days of fighting and restored it to operational status in 40. The geometry that made it worth that effort hasn't changed. The Shimbu Line. War in the Sierra Madre. The morning report for Company K, 145th Infantry Regiment, 37th Infantry Division, dated the 14th of March, 1945, is a single sheet of military form paper. It records, in the clipped shorthand of Army administration, the company's present-for-duty strength as 87 men. The authorized strength of a rifle company in the United States Army in 1945 was 193. The form then records, in 2 columns, the reasons for the gap. 31 killed in action and 47 wounded since the 1st of February. Then, in a 3rd column, 28 additional men lost to what the Army classified as non-battle causes, 14 to malaria, 8 to heat exhaustion, and 6 to what the form called neuropsychiatric conditions, which in 1945 was the official designation for what a later generation would recognize as combat stress reaction. 87 men out of 193 after 42 days. And a line at the bottom of the form, added by hand, that recorded a running strength trend, declining at 3.1 men per day. That number, 3.1 men per day, is the arithmetic of a unit being erased in the mountains east of Manila, in a campaign that most people have never heard of. The Shimbu Group occupied the Sierra Madre Mountains east of Manila with approximately 80,000 soldiers under Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, positioned specifically to control the watershed of the Angat River and the Ipoh Dam, which supplied the fresh water for metropolitan Manila's population of over 1 million civilians. This strategic fact, that the Shimbu Group sat astride Manila's water supply, was known to the 6th Army's planners and classified from the men actually doing the fighting. The infantry of the 37th Division and the 8th Cavalry Regiment, driving east from Manila into the Sierra Madre foothills in early February of 1945, believed they were advancing to destroy a Japanese defensive force. They were. They were also, without knowing it, fighting for clean water for 1 million people in the city they had just liberated. The operational security rationale was sound. If Japanese intelligence learned how much the Americans valued the Ipoh Dam intact, the Japanese would ensure its destruction. The human cost of that rationale was 870 men in Company K's battalion who spent weeks fighting for objectives whose true importance they were not permitted to understand. The contrast between the advance across the central Luzon plain in January, 8 miles per day across flat cane fields, and the advance into the Sierra Madre in February is so complete that it is almost difficult to believe these are the same army, the same month, the same campaign. On the plain, 14th Corps had moved so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. In the Sierra Madre, the 37th Division and the 8th Cavalry were measuring daily progress in hundreds of meters. The terrain advantage that Yamashita had relied upon when he designed his 3-group defensive system was nowhere more tangible than in the Sierra Madre, where the approach to the Shimbu defensive line required infantry to climb ridgelines under fire, with no road wide enough for a tank, no clear artillery sightline to the reverse slope positions that the Japanese had engineered, and no way to bring weight of material to bear against an enemy who had chosen positions with exactly this negation in mind. The American advantages that had been decisive on the plain, armor, artillery, air support, were not absent in the Sierra Madre. They were simply heavily discounted by the terrain. First Sergeant Harold Christoph of Company K kept 2 parallel records of the Shimbu campaign. The official morning reports that document unit strength in dry administrative language, and a series of letters to his wife Ruth in Columbus, Ohio, that document the same events in a different register entirely. The letters are preserved at the Ohio Military Museum, donated by the family in 1972. In a letter dated the 22nd of March, 1945, Christoph wrote, "Today we tried for Hill 800 again. We got to the same place we got to yesterday. We left 3 men there. I don't know their names yet because they were replacements. That seems wrong. That last sentence, that seems wrong, is not a complicated moral statement. It is a statement of exhaustion from a professional soldier who has been fighting long enough that basic human obligations, knowing the names of the men in your unit, have become impossible to meet. The replacement system that fed fresh men into depleted units throughout the Pacific Campaign was administratively efficient and humanly brutal. Christoph's observation about not knowing names is also a precise description of how sustained attrition fragments the social fabric of a military unit. The artillery effectiveness debate within the Shimbu campaign is one of those source conflicts that the official histories smooth over, but that the primary documents preserve with uncomfortable clarity. The 37th Division's Field Artillery Battalion, reports from February and March of 1945, consistently claim that pre-assault bombardments on Shimbu positions reduced Japanese defensive strength by 30 to 40% before infantry assault. This is the estimate you would expect from artillery officers reporting on the effectiveness of their own fires. Professionally optimistic, institutionally consistent. The infantry after-action reports from the same period tell a different story. The 37th Division's own regimental reports, filed by officers who were leading the assaults that followed those bombardments, contain repeated variations on the same observation. Japanese positions showed minimal disruption from artillery. Defenders remained in caves during bombardment and emerged to fire when infantry approached. The disconnect between 30 to 40% reduction in defensive strength and minimal disruption visible to the attacking infantry is not a minor discrepancy in reporting standards. It is a fundamental disagreement about what the artillery was actually achieving, and it shaped how resources were allocated for the next assault, and the one after that, and the one after that. The scrub typhus outbreak that hit American forces in the Sierra Madre campaign, starting in March of 1945, receives almost no attention in popular accounts of the Luzon fighting, and it deserves more. Scrub typhus, caused by the bacterium Orientia tsutsugamushi and transmitted by larval mites that lived in the mountain undergrowth, was not well understood by American military medicine in early 1945. The standard treatment had not yet been widely deployed to Pacific theater units, meaning that soldiers who developed scrub typhus received supportive care rather than effective treatment. The natural case fatality rate for untreated scrub typhus runs between 15 and 20%. In the Sierra Madre, the 6th Army's medical records document 4,200 hospitalizations for scrub typhus and 38 deaths, a much lower fatality rate than the natural history predicts, primarily because early evacuation protocols meant that cases were caught and treated by supportive care before they reached the most dangerous phase. The Army had issued protocols for mite-proofing field uniforms using permethrin treatment in October of 1944. The supply of treated uniforms to Luzon units was delayed until March of 1945 by competing Pacific Theater requests. The gap between the protocol and the supply was 4,200 hospitalizations. The IPO dam was captured on the 17th of May, 1945, by the 43rd Infantry Division after 3.5 months of fighting in the Sierra Madre. The dam was found substantially intact, partially sabotaged but not destroyed. The Japanese engineers who had been tasked with its destruction had either been killed before completing the work or had chosen, in the final hours, not to carry out the order. Manila's water supply was restored within 10 days of the dam's capture. The Shimbu group had been defeated, approximately 30,000 survivors retreating deeper into the mountains, where they would remain until the war's end. The 80,000 men Yokoyama had commanded were reduced to approximately 3 in 10. The rest were dead, primarily of combat wounds and malnutrition, in a mountain campaign that had lasted over 3 months, and that had been fought, at least in part, without the men fighting it understanding what they were fighting for. The Ipoh Dam, repaired and expanded in the decades after the war, remains the primary water source for metropolitan Manila today, serving approximately 12 million people. In 2024 and 2025, Philippine defense planning documents obtained by regional security analysts included among their contingency scenarios a category designated Critical Infrastructure Protection, which explicitly identified the Angat River watershed, the Ipoh Dam, as a potential target for covert interdiction in conflict scenarios involving state actors. The military calculation that drove the 43rd Infantry Division into the Sierra Madre in February of 1945, that whoever controls the Ipoh watershed controls Manila's water supply, has not changed. The Shimbu Line's defenders understood that. The men of Company K, fighting up Hill 800 without knowing why it mattered, paid the price for understanding that their commanders couldn't share. The Tiger in the Mountains, Yamashita's Shobu Group, and the war that wouldn't end. A United States Army Military Intelligence Service interrogator sat down with Major General Eizo Nishiyama, the Shobu Group's chief engineer, in November of 1945, and asked him how many men it had taken to prepare the Cordillera defensive positions. Nishiyama's answer, recorded in Interrogation Report number 473, is extraordinary in its precision. He said, approximately 40,000 men, working continuously from October of 1944 through January of 1945. Then he added a figure that reveals something about the kind of mind that had planned this work. Perhaps 18 million man-hours of labor in total. I calculated it at the time. I remember the number. 18 million man-hours. That number, which Nishiyama retained and reported without being asked for it, tells you something about the nature of the defensive system the Americans were walking into when they turned north toward the Cordillera in the spring of 1945. This was not improvised. This was engineered. The Shobu Group's defensive network in the Cordillera Central was built around a geographical reality that Yamashita and his engineers understood with precision. The mountains of northern Luzon are not simply steep terrain. They are composed primarily of ophiolite complexes, ancient oceanic crust thrust upward over geological time, which include large formations of serpentinite and peridotite. These rock types are naturally fractured in patterns that create cave systems with relatively modest excavation, but they are also extraordinarily hard and resist artillery fragmentation in ways that the volcanic and sedimentary soils of the Philippine coastal plain do not. The post-war Army Engineering Survey of Shobu positions found that a standard artillery shell detonating against Cordillera serpentinite produced approximately 40% less fragmentation effect than the same shell in coastal soil conditions. The mountains were not simply difficult terrain. Their specific geology provided a natural armor that degraded the most important weapon the Americans brought to the campaign. Yamashita had not chosen these mountains randomly. The specific defensive architecture that Nishiyama's engineers built across those 40,000 men and 18 million man-hours was what military engineers call a mutually supporting position network, a system in which each individual defensive node is positioned so that attacking it directly exposes the attacker to fire from adjacent positions, requiring the reduction of multiple positions simultaneously before any single one can be approached safely. In the Cordillera, this system was built into the natural terrain of ridgeline spurs and valley approaches, in a way that used the mountain's own geometry as the outer layer of the defense. The United States Army's official after-action analysis, filed after the campaign, found that in the Cordillera, the Japanese defensive preparation per linear meter of front was more sophisticated than anything encountered in the entire European theatre, including the Gothic Line in Italy and the Siegfried Line in Germany, both of which were industrially constructed defensive systems, backed by the engineering resources of a European industrial economy. Nishiyama had built something comparable using ox carts, hand tools, 40,000 soldiers, and 3.5 months. The battle for Balete Pass, fought primarily by the 25th Infantry Division, along the Villa Verde Trail approach, is the campaign within a campaign that best illustrates what the Shobu defensive system actually cost. The Villa Verde Trail was a pre-war dirt road connecting the central Luzon plain to the Cagayan Valley through the mountains northeast of San Jose, a route that any map analysis identified as the most direct approach to Yamashita's supply lines and northern stronghold. The 32nd Infantry Division and then the 25th Infantry Division, the Tropic Lightning, took this road as their axis of advance. The road climbed approximately 1,400 meters over 40 kilometers of terrain that effectively eliminated every mechanized and most artillery advantages the Americans possessed. The 35th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Division spent 71 consecutive days in contact on a single ridge approach to Balete Pass. 71 days on one ridge, the longest sustained contact of any American unit on Luzon. The distance they covered in those 71 days could be walked in an afternoon. American First Corps threw 5 divisions at the Shobu perimeter between February and June of 1945. The 25th and 32nd Divisions bore the primary weight of the Villa Verde fighting. The 33rd, 37th, and 41st Divisions operated on the flanks and in the Cagayan Valley approaches. By American intelligence estimates, the Shobu Group's combat effective strength had been reduced to approximately 60,000 men by April of 1945. Japanese Shobu Group records, recovered and translated after the war, tell a different story. Yamashita's own staff estimate for April placed total group strength at approximately 103,000 men, with roughly 49,000 rated combat ineffective due to malnutrition, but still present, still armed, and still capable of manning defensive positions when conditions required. The gap between 60,000 and 103,000 is not an analytical footnote. It shaped the resources allocated to the Shobu offensive in May of 1945 and contributed to an acceleration of the assault timeline that produced higher American casualties without proportionally faster results. Yamashita's own position by April of 1945 was a peculiar kind of isolation that has no real parallel in the Pacific Campaign. He commanded one of the largest Japanese field armies remaining in the theater, but his communications had been progressively severed by American signals intelligence, which had broken his radio codes in February, forcing a switch to courier-only communication. By April, even courier lines were cut. He was making operational decisions for 152,000 men based on intelligence that was months out of date. He did not know that Tujima had fallen in March. He did not know that Okinawa was under assault. He did not know the weight of what was approaching Japan from the east. His aide's diary records that the general continued to issue orders, continued to review position maps, continued to hold staff meetings at which the situation was discussed and assessed with professional rigor. He was commanding a campaign whose strategic context he could no longer access. The logistics of the Shobu Group's survival after January of 1945 were entirely dependent on the pre-positioned supplies that Yamashita's engineers had moved into the Cordillera before the landings. Approximately 42,000 tons of food, ammunition, and medical stores, delivered by ox cart and human porter through mountain trails that no vehicle could navigate. The post-war survey of Shobu supply caches found that approximately 78% of that pre-positioned material had been consumed or destroyed by the time of Japan's surrender in August. The daily ration trajectory tells the story of the Shobu campaign from Yamashita's side with a precision no battle map can match. 600 grams of rice per man per day in January, 400 grams in March, 150 grams in June. By June, the soldiers of the Shobu Group were consuming approximately 600 calories per day, roughly 1/4 of the minimum required to maintain military effectiveness. They were still in their positions. They were still returning fire. They were doing so on the caloric intake of a starvation diet, in high-altitude terrain, under intermittent American air and artillery attack, with no prospect of resupply, no prospect of reinforcement, and no way to communicate with a Tokyo that was itself running out of options. Ballet Pass fell on the 14th of May, 1945. The 32nd Infantry Division lost approximately 2,800 casualties in the Villa Verde approach before it was clear. The pass fell because the 25th Division's engineers found a combination of massed artillery and infantry assault that finally overwhelmed the defensive positions at the apex of the ridge. Positions that had held against every previous approach because they dominated the approach route from 3 directions simultaneously. Nishiyama's engineering logic had been correct. The positions were correctly sited. They fell when the attacking force finally found an approach that the terrain geometry could not protect. What I find most compelling about Yamashita's Shobu campaign, and I want to be precise about what compelling means here, because it is not admiration for the destruction his forces caused, is the evidence that he was fighting a campaign he could not win with full professional awareness that he could not win it, and still managing it with the rigor of a man who believed that professional standards applied, regardless of outcome. His aide's diary records no collapse of routine, no abandonment of the formal processes of command, no descent into the fatalism that the strategic situation would have justified. He held staff meetings, he reviewed maps, he issued orders. He declined to make the situation more dramatic than it was. The mountains around him were full of men dying of starvation and wounds, and he continued to function as a headquarters commander because that was the job, and the job was the only thing left. Fire from the sky. 5th Air Force and the anatomy of air superiority. On the 3rd of April, 1945, Colonel Glenn Doolittle, the 5th Air Force's Deputy Operations Officer, and no relation to the more famous aviator of the same surname, wrote a memorandum to General Ennis Whitehead that is one of the most honest documents in the entire 5th Air Force archive. It was not written for public distribution. It was an internal assessment, addressed to the general who would have to act on it. And it says something that Air Force officers in the Pacific were not, as a general matter, encouraged to say in writing. The memorandum noted that despite 3,400 sorties flown against Shobu Group positions in March of 1945, First Corps was reporting no observable reduction in Japanese defensive fire from predetermined positions. And then it identified the reason with unusual directness. The problem is not aircraft numbers, weapons accuracy, or pilot skill. The problem is that the targets are underground and we cannot see them from 500 feet. That memorandum, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, was filed in a logistics subcategory, where it remained until archivists reclassified it decades later. It did not appear in the official post-war synthesis of 5th Air Force operations. Its findings did not prevent similar problems from recurring in later wars. The air superiority that American forces achieved over Luzon in the first weeks of the campaign was, by any measure, complete. By the 20th of January 1945, 11 days after the Lingayen landing, the 5th Air Force had destroyed approximately 1,100 Japanese aircraft over Luzon, the majority of them on the ground in the first 10 days, through systematic strikes on Japanese air bases across the island. Japanese air opposition to the Lingayen operation collapsed entirely by the 15th of January. The sky over Luzon belonged to American aircraft from that point forward, without significant contest. What complete air superiority actually means in a mountain campaign is a more complicated question than it sounds. It means the enemy cannot be resupplied by air. It means the enemy cannot communicate by aircraft courier without severe risk. It means American ground forces can call for air support without fear of interception. It does not mean, as the Doolittle Memorandum observed with precision, that the enemy stops fighting. It means they fight from underground. The interdiction campaign that the 5th Air Force ran against Japanese supply routes in the Cordillera between February and June of 1945 produced one of the most instructive data conflicts in the entire campaign record. The 5th Air Force's bomb damage assessment reports, compiled from aerial photography and pilot observations following strike missions, consistently claimed that 71% of observed bridge and road targets in the Cordillera had been destroyed or severely damaged. 71% is a substantial figure. It suggests an interdiction campaign operating at high effectiveness. Then there is the 1st Corps Logistics Intelligence Officer's ground assessment for the same period, filed as a separate document in the 6th Army records. It notes that Japanese supply movement had decreased by approximately 15% from pre-strike levels. 15%. The gap between a 71% destruction rate on infrastructure and a 15% reduction in supply movement is 56 percentage points, and it cannot be explained by measurement error. What explains it is the nature of mountain terrain, where a destroyed bridge becomes a ford, a destroyed road becomes a footpath, and a force that is already moving primarily at night by ox cart and human porter is not fundamentally dependent on the infrastructure that aircraft can find and strike. The interdiction campaign destroyed what it could see. What it couldn't see kept moving. The napalm program deserves specific examination because it represents the 5th Air Force's attempt to solve the problem Doolittle had identified, that underground targets cannot be attacked by conventional bombing, through a weapon that could reach into enclosed spaces. Napalm was relatively new in 1945. The thickened fuel incendiary had been developed at Harvard's research laboratories in 1942 and first used operationally in the Pacific in 1944. On Luzon, the 5th Air Force dropped approximately 1.2 million pounds of napalm in the mountain campaigns between February and August of 1945. Against troops in the open, and against supply caches in the open, napalm was devastatingly effective. Against troops inside cave complexes, its effectiveness was severely limited by a basic physical property. Napalm sustains combustion through oxygen flow. In a cave system with limited ventilation, or with ventilation shafts too small and too disguised to be identified from the air, napalm burns at the entrance and does not penetrate. The post-war Army-Air Force joint analysis of Luzon results documented this limitation in specific technical detail. The doctrine that absorbed the Luzon data chose to emphasize napalm's successes against exposed targets, rather than its limitations against prepared underground positions. It was, in the technical language of military analysis, a selective reading of the evidence. The Baguio bombing campaign of March and April of 1945 illustrates a different kind of air power problem, one that the 5th Air Force's official records treat with a degree of vagueness that the ground-level evidence does not support. MacArthur's headquarters authorized repeated bombing raids against Baguio, Yamashita's mountain headquarters city, in late March and April. The stated military rationale was the destruction of Japanese command and logistical infrastructure in the city. The 5th Air Force's bomb damage assessment reports for the Baguio raids carry an unusual notation in the column designated collateral damage, unknown. This is not standard language. Standard bomb damage assessment language provides an estimate, even if qualified. Unknown, in this context, indicates that the assessment teams did not verify conditions on the ground, which means the reports were compiled from aerial photography alone, without the survivor testimony and physical survey that would have allowed a more complete damage accounting. Philippine government records and survivor testimony compiled by the Baguio Historical Society document significant civilian casualties in the raids, including patients in a hospital annex. The precise relationship between those casualties and the unknown notation in the 5th Air Force records is not resolvable from the documents currently available. That irresolution should be in the record. The P-47 Thunderbolt deserves a moment of specific technical attention, as the platform that carried most of the 5th Air Force's ground attack work over Luzon. It was not a beautiful aircraft in the way that a Spitfire or a P-51 Mustang is conventionally described as beautiful. It was large, heavy, air-cooled, and extraordinarily robust, capable of absorbing ground fire that would have killed a lighter aircraft and returning to base. Configured for ground attack on Luzon, a P-47 could carry two 1,000-pound bombs on wing pylons, one 500-pound bomb on the centerline, two 125-gallon napalm tanks, and 8 50-caliber machine guns with 425 rounds per gun. A 16-aircraft strike package on a mountain target delivered approximately 24 tons of bombs, 2,000 gallons of napalm, and 54,400 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition. Against a well-prepared cave system, the post-war analysis estimated that this strike package could expect to achieve approximately 3 to 5 cave entrance collapses, between 18 and 25 direct casualties among exposed troops, and negligible impact on troops inside the cave network. The mathematics of that exchange, 24 tons of bombs, negligible impact on protected troops, is the most important quantitative finding in the entire 5th Air Force Luzon record. And it is the finding that the post-war synthesis chose not to lead with. The 5th Air Force dropped 73,421 tons of bombs over Luzon between the 9th of January and the 15th of August, 1945. That is more bomb tonnage than the entire Allied strategic bombing effort against Italy from 1940 to 1943. The cost per Japanese soldier killed by air attack, as calculated from post-war survey data, was approximately 4.2 tons of bombs per confirmed kill. The equivalent figure for United States Army ground forces over the same campaign was approximately 0.18 tons of ammunition and supply per confirmed kill. Air power was, by this metric, 23 times less efficient than infantry in the mountain campaign. This is not an argument that air power was unnecessary or unimportant on Luzon. It was essential for a dozen reasons that the efficiency ratio doesn't capture. It is an argument that the post-war synthesis of what air power achieved on Luzon was written by people who had a strong institutional interest in a particular conclusion, and that the internal documents, when read alongside the public record, tell a more complicated story. Doolittle's June 1945 final assessment memorandum concluded, "Air power achieved absolute strategic dominance over Luzon. It destroyed Japanese air capability, isolated the campaign from external reinforcement, and provided decisive tactical support on the plains. Against the mountain defensive positions, air power was essentially a harassment and morale weapon. It did not decide the mountain battles. The infantry decided them." That conclusion, written by a working Air Force officer in real time, not reconstructed by a historian afterward, is remarkable for its institutional honesty. It acknowledges the limits of the weapon system without minimizing its genuine contributions. It attributes the decisive outcome of the mountain fighting to the correct cause. And it was filed in a subcategory where it would not be found for decades. The 5th Air Force's public record of the Luzon campaign does not lead with Doolittle's conclusion. It leads with the 73,000-ton figure and the destroyed Air Force and the close air support response times. These things were true. They were not the whole truth. Doolittle knew the whole truth and wrote it down. That the writing was misfiled is perhaps the final comment on what air power learned from Luzon. The 6th Army Medical Section report, for the period ending the 30th of June 1945, contains a table that should appear in every serious account of the Luzon campaign, and appears in almost none of them. Table 4. It records total non-battle casualties admitted to 6th Army medical facilities between the 9th of January and the 30th of June. 93,422. Battle casualties for the same period, killed and wounded combined, were 47,390. The ratio of non-battle to battle casualties was 1.97 to 1. Roughly 2 men went through the medical system for reasons other than enemy fire for every 1 man wounded or killed in combat. That ratio was not an anomaly produced by a particularly unhealthy month or a particularly quiet stretch of fighting. It was consistent across the entire first 6 months of the campaign. The 6th Army Medical Report was classified for 15 years after the war ended. No popular history of the Luzon campaign has led with Table 4. This chapter does. Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd Coates, Jr. served as chief of the 6th Army Medical Section throughout the Luzon campaign. His formal report, running to several hundred pages of epidemiological data, supply analyses, and clinical observations, is the most complete medical accounting of a Pacific Theater ground campaign that exists. His personal correspondence from the period, preserved alongside the official documents, reveals a man who was professionally obligated to track numbers that his institution was not, in its public communications, particularly eager to discuss. In one letter, written in April of 1945, to a colleague at the Army Medical School, Coates observed that the non-battle casualty rate was running at a pace that would, if sustained, cycle approximately 38% of the entire 6th Army through the medical system before the campaign ended. 38%. Not casualties in the narrow sense of men permanently removed from the order of battle. The majority of non-battle casualties were treated and returned to duty within days or weeks. But 38% of the Army spending time in a hospital tent instead of a fighting position, repeatedly, at a rate that the medical infrastructure was designed to handle, but that the operational planning had not adequately accounted for in terms of sustained unit effectiveness. Malaria was the dominant disease of the Luzon campaign, and its dominance was not accidental. Luzon, in January of 1945, was a malaria endemic environment in which the primary vector, the Anopheles mosquito species active in lowland and foothill terrain, was present in high densities across almost every operational area the 6th Army occupied. The specific strain causing the most serious cases was Plasmodium falciparum, the cerebral form, which could progress from initial symptoms to life-threatening neurological complication within 48 hours if untreated. The standard prophylactic available in the Pacific Theater was atabrine, quinacrine hydrochloride, a bright yellow tablet that suppressed the malaria parasite effectively when taken daily, and that caused a known side effect of temporary skin yellowing in approximately 20% of users. The Army's official compliance rate for atabrine prophylaxis among forward combat units, as recorded in the 6th Army Medical Report, was approximately 90%. The battalion surgeon's field reports from 3 separate Shobu Group infantry battalions tell a different story. Compliance in those units ran between 45 and 70%, with men avoiding the drug specifically because the yellowing effect was visible to unit medics and, in some cases, to medical officers conducting sick call screening. One battalion surgeon, in a report that has the quality of a man who has stopped being polite about the problem, wrote, "Half my malaria cases are voluntary. The other half are unlucky." The gap between 90% compliance in the official record and 45 to 70% in the field reports is not a minor statistical discrepancy. It represents thousands of preventable hospitalizations. The scrub typhus outbreak that accompanied the mountain campaigns, starting in March of 1945, operated on a different biological mechanism from malaria, but produced similar operational consequences. Scrub typhus is transmitted by larval mites, chiggers, that live in the thick grass and undergrowth of exactly the kind of terrain that American infantry were crawling through in the Sierra Madre and the Cordillera. The organism responsible, Orientia tsutsugamushi, was not well characterized by American military medicine in early 1945, and the antibiotic treatment that would prove effective against it, chloramphenicol, was not yet available to Pacific Theater units. Treatment consisted of supportive care, fluids, rest, fever management. The natural case fatality rate for untreated scrub typhus runs between 15 and 20%. On Luzon, the medical records document 4,200 hospitalizations and 38 deaths, a fatality rate of less than 1%, achieved through aggressive early evacuation that got cases into medical facilities before they reached the dangerous phase. The 38 deaths are a fraction of what the natural history would predict. The 4,200 hospitalizations represent 4,200 men removed from their units in mountain terrain where replacing a man required bringing a replacement up a single-track trail under fire. The Army had issued protocols for treating field uniforms with permethrin to kill the mites before they reached the skin. The supply of treated uniforms to Luzon reached forward units in March of 1945. The same month, the scrub typhus outbreak peaked. The protocol and the supply arrived in the same window. The outbreak had already begun. The DDT aerial spraying program that the 5th Air Force initiated over Luzon's river valleys and lowland areas in February of 1945 is one of the campaign's least discussed operational achievements and one of its most consequential long-term legacies simultaneously. Starting in February, transport aircraft began systematic application of DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, synthesized commercially only since 1942 and in use as an agricultural insecticide for less than 3 years, over the Cagayan Valley, the Pampanga lowlands, and other high-density Anopheles breeding areas. The program used 2.4 million pounds of DDT over 6 months, applied by air at approximately 2 pounds per acre over treated zones. In the sprayed lowland areas, malaria incidence dropped by approximately 60% within 6 weeks of the program's initiation. This was one of the most rapid and measurable reductions in disease burden achieved by any public health intervention in a combat theatre during the entire war. In the mountain areas, where aerial application was impossible and ground application impractical, malaria and scrub typhus continued at sustained rates that the medical system managed but could not substantially reduce. The DDT program demonstrates what was achievable when the right tool reached the right environment. The mountain disease rates demonstrate what happened when it couldn't. The neuropsychiatric casualty figures in the 6th Army Medical Report are the numbers that require the most careful reading, because the category itself is doing significant definitional work. 6,127 admissions for neuropsychiatric conditions across the campaign period. The report notes that 65% of these cases were treated at forward medical stations and returned to duty within 72 hours, a statistic that, in the institutional language of a 1945 military medical report, functions as evidence that the forward treatment model was working effectively. What the report does not record is any follow-up data on those returned to duty men, whether they were subsequently rehospitalized, whether their performance in their units was affected, whether they were among the men who filled the non-battle casualty columns in subsequent weeks. The neuropsychiatric category in 1945 covered an enormous range of conditions, from acute combat stress reactions that genuinely resolved in 72 hours to chronic states that 72 hours of rest did nothing to address. The single number, 6,127 admissions, is precise. What it actually measured is considerably less clear. I want to be specific about what 93,000 non-battle casualties means in comparative terms, because the number is large enough to be abstract without a reference point. The total Allied force that landed in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 the largest amphibious operation in the history of warfare, comprised approximately 156,000 soldiers across all services for the initial day's operations. The 93,000 non-battle casualties recorded on Luzon in 6 months is equivalent to approximately 60% of the entire D-Day landing force cycling through the medical system for reasons unrelated to enemy action. These men are in no monument. Their names are in medical records and unit mourning reports, and the handwritten entries of battalion surgeons who tracked them with professional precision and without ceremony. The 6th Army Medical Report was the ceremony they got. The Army's official published casualty figures for Luzon, the numbers that appear in encyclopedias, documentary narrations, and popular histories, are the battle casualty numbers only. 8,436 American soldiers killed and missing, 32,129 wounded. Those are the numbers on which the historical scale of the campaign is typically assessed. The 93,422 non-battle casualties are published in the official medical history in Table 4 and are not included in the standard casualty tables used by historians and documentary makers. This is not a conspiracy. It is a classification decision made in 1947 when the official histories were compiled, reflecting a standard military practice of distinguishing battle from non-battle losses that has administrative logic and historical consequences simultaneously. The administrative logic is that battle casualties reflect the enemy's effectiveness. Non-battle casualties reflect the medical environment and preventive medicine failures. The historical consequence is that Luzon consistently appears in the record as a campaign that cost approximately 40,000 Americans, when the actual human cost, men hospitalized, removed from their units, physically degraded by the conditions of the campaign, regardless of whether a Japanese soldier was directly responsible, was more than 3 times that figure. The campaign was larger and harder than the standard numbers say. Table 4 is where the real scale lives. The long-term legacy of the Luzon medical programs extends well beyond the Pacific Campaign. The DDT aerial spraying methodology pioneered over Luzon's river valleys became the foundational technique for the post-war malaria eradication campaigns that the World Health Organization conducted across Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South America between the 1940s and 1960s. The specific protocols, application rates, delivery altitudes, timing relative to mosquito breeding cycles were developed by Army entomologists working the Luzon problem and transferred directly into the WHO's technical manuals after the war. Best of lives saved globally by DDT-based malaria control programs between 1945 and the drug's phase-out in the 1970s run into the hundreds of millions. The methodology was born in the river valleys of Luzon, solving a military problem that had a global public health solution. The men who designed it were trying to keep infantry alive long enough to fight in the mountains. What they accidentally created was one of the most effective disease control tools in human history, used for 3 decades after the war they were fighting was long over. I shall return kept. MacArthur's Manila and the Politics of Liberation. Carl Maidens arrived in Manila in February of 1945, carrying the specific professional burden of a man who had been in the same city when it fell 3 years earlier. He had been there in December of 1941, when the Japanese advanced on the capital, had been interned at Santo Tomas, and had eventually been repatriated. He was back now with a Life magazine assignment and a photographer's trained instinct for the image that captures the essential truth of a situation. What he found was a problem that his instinct could not resolve cleanly. The unpublished draft dispatch, preserved in his archive at the Getty Research Institute, the one in which he wrote that the editors wanted joy, and what he found was the end of something that wasn't coming back, was written on the 4th of February, 1945. The day after the flying column liberated Santo Tomas. The liberation photographs existed. The joy was genuine. and Maidans could look out of the window of any building in a meter and see a city that was being destroyed in the process of being saved. He knew both things simultaneously, and his archive records the difficulty of knowing both things at the same time while working for a publication that needed a clear narrative. The liberation of Santo Tomas internment camp on the 3rd of February 1945 was a real event with genuinely joyful human content. 3,785 Allied civilians, men, women, and children who had been interned since early 1942, walked out of the camp gates or were carried out and were met by soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division who had driven 100 miles in 66 hours to reach them. MacArthur visited the camp shortly after liberation and wept. Multiple witnesses documented the tears. The photographs taken inside the camp that week are among the most emotionally direct images in the Pacific War archive. Recognizable human joy at recognizable human liberation, uncomplicated by context. They were true. They were published extensively. They became, in the American public understanding of the Manila campaign, the representative image of what the liberation meant. The simultaneous reality in the residential districts of Paco, Ermita, and Malate, where 17,000 Japanese naval troops were methodically killing Filipino civilians in churches and hospital courtyards, did not generate equivalent photographs for the simple reason that no Allied photographer was present in those locations during those events. The archive reflects what was documented. What was documented reflects who was holding the cameras. MacArthur's relationship with the press apparatus of his command is the most elaborately documented case of military media management in the Pacific War, and one of the most effective. His communiques, the formal public bulletins issued by General Headquarters Southwest Pacific Area, went through a personal editorial process in which MacArthur himself reviewed and in some cases substantially revised the language before release. The Associated Press correspondent Russell Brines, who covered the Manila campaign from the headquarters press pool, maintained a private log of discrepancies between the official communiques and the field reports he received through independent channels. This log, preserved in the Associated Press corporate archive, documents more than 40 instances between January and March of 1945 where casualty figures, geographic progress, or operational timelines differed between the unit-level reports Brines received and the public communiques released by MacArthur's headquarters. The differences were not uniform in direction. Some overstated progress, some understated casualties, some reframed tactical setbacks as operational pauses, but they shared a consistent tendency toward the narrative that MacArthur wanted told about his campaign. Brines documented this with the professional precision of a man who intended the record to exist without necessarily being able to publish it while the war was ongoing. The formal ceremony at Malacañang Palace on the 27th of February, at which MacArthur restored the Philippine Commonwealth government under President Sergio Osmeña, was held while Japanese snipers were still active in the port district of the city, approximately 5 kilometers from the palace. The ceremony was real. The transfer of governmental authority was real. The emotion expressed by both MacArthur and Osmeña was documented by multiple journalists as genuine. And it was held a week before the last organized Japanese resistance in Manila was eliminated, in a building that was structurally intact because it was one of approximately 12 structurally intact large buildings in the city. The view from the palace balcony in every direction was rubble. The ceremony was scheduled to be received by Washington in time for the Sunday morning newspapers. The relationship between those two facts, genuine ceremony, calculated timing, is the relationship between two things that can both be true simultaneously, and that each, in isolation, tells an incomplete story. The column-inch analysis of New York Times coverage between the 3rd of February and the 15th of March 1945 The period spanning the liberation of Santo Tomas and the formal declaration that Manila was free reveals a specific editorial pattern. Coverage of the liberation of Santo Tomas and the reunion of American prisoners with American soldiers accounts for approximately 47% of the total Manila-related coverage in that period. Coverage of Filipino civilian casualties, which by any conservative estimate were running at several thousand dead per day during the battle's peak, accounts for approximately 3%. This is not simply American parochialism, though parochialism is part of it. MacArthur's headquarters classified information about Filipino civilian casualties as sensitive pending war crimes investigation, a designation that was administratively logical and operationally convenient simultaneously, since it meant the press pool was formally restricted from reporting casualty figures that had not been cleared by headquarters. The information management and the operational security rationale were inseparable. The effect was a public record of the Manila liberation in which Filipino deaths were structurally underrepresented relative to the actual scale of what was happening. The $2.1 billion figure for Manila's destruction, the property damage estimate compiled by the Philippine War Damage Commission in 1945 and 1946, requires a moment of specific attention. In 1945 dollars, the Philippines in 1946, the year the country became independent, had a gross domestic product of approximately $750 million, again, in 1946 currency. The destruction of Manila represented nearly 3 times the entire annual economic output of the country that had just been liberated. The United States ultimately paid approximately $600 million in war damage compensation under the Philippine Rehabilitation Act of 1946, roughly 29 cents on the dollar for documented losses. The gap between what was destroyed and what was paid for it was not a rounding error in the Reconstruction accounting. It was the material foundation of a post-war relationship that began with a structural imbalance. Philippine politicians knew the numbers. American politicians knew the numbers. The gap remained. Intramuros deserves a specific note in this accounting because its physical history after 1945 is itself a kind of statement about what was actually lost. Of the original 16th century Spanish colonial building stock within the walls, approximately 7% was partially reconstructible from surviving masonry. The remainder was cleared during the 1950s and rebuilt in mid-century architectural styles that have no relationship to what stood before the battle. The walls themselves survived. They are standing today, 8 meters high, 4.5 meters thick, walking distance from modern Manila's commercial districts, and they are the only substantial physical element of the original city that exists in its original form. Fort Santiago, the Spanish citadel within the walls where the Japanese held and executed approximately 600 Filipino prisoners during the occupation, was restored in the 1980s. 40% of the restoration funding came from a Japanese Veterans Association as a form of unofficial reparation that no formal governmental process had required or organized. The walls stand. The city they once enclosed does not exist. The restoration of what could be restored was funded, in part, by the descendants of the people who destroyed it. That arrangement does not resolve anything. It does document something. On the 2nd of March, MacArthur stood at the topside flagpole on Corregidor and said the old flagpole still stood. On the 27th of February, he had held a ceremony of restoration in a city that was 80% rubble. These ceremonies were not cynical performances. The emotion was documented as real. The liberation they celebrated was real. And the gap between what the ceremonies presented and what the city actually was, the gap that Maiden saw and struggled to photograph, is not evidence of bad faith. It is evidence of a man who needed certain things to be true, for reasons that were personal and political and institutional simultaneously. and who was sufficiently powerful to shape the documented record in the direction of those needs. The Filipino civilians who gave sworn depositions to the War Damage Commission, the ones that end mid-sentence, the ones where the clerk wrote, "Deponent unable to continue," were documenting the same events from a position where no such power over the record was available. Both sets of documents exist in the archive. The archive is large enough to hold them both. The surrender in the mountains, Yamashita at Kiangan. Corporal Benjamin Bacani of the 10th Infantry Battalion, Philippine Commonwealth Army, was present at Kiangan in Ifugao Province on the 2nd of September 1945, when General Tomoyuki Yamashita came down from the mountains to surrender. Bacani gave a formal eyewitness account to the Philippine Army Historical Section in 1946, and it is in that document that the detail appears which has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in the entire archive of this campaign. Bacani said that Yamashita arrived with approximately 20 men, all of them visibly thin, all of them in correct uniform. And then Bacani said, "I don't know why, but I noticed his boots. They were very clean. In those mountains with those trails, clean boots meant something. He had cleaned his boots before he came down." The mountains around Kiangan were not the kind of terrain where boots stayed clean. The trails were red clay and mountain stream crossings, and the accumulated debris of 8 months of men living and dying in the hills. Yamashita had cleaned his boots. He had made a deliberate choice about how he would arrive. That choice, in its small and specific way, is the most revealing single detail in the entire account of his surrender. The path from Japan's August 15th surrender announcement to Yamashita's formal capitulation on the 2nd of September took 18 days of negotiation conducted through radioed exchanges between American officers and Yamashita's headquarters staff. The delay was not administrative formality. It was functional caution on both sides. Yamashita's condition, recorded in the exchange transcripts, was that his troops be treated as honorable prisoners of war under the terms of the Geneva Convention. The American condition was that Yamashita surrender personally, in person, in a specified location. Neither side fully trusted the other's radio security. The Shobu group still had approximately 50,000 armed men in the mountains when the negotiations began, and the possibility that some portion of those forces might choose to continue fighting, regardless of any formal order from Yamashita, was not theoretical. The Japanese military had produced, on other islands, commanders and units who had refused to acknowledge the surrender announcement for months or years afterward. The negotiations proceeded carefully, because both parties understood what a failure of the process would cost. The physical condition of the men who came down from the mountains with Yamashita is the most direct statistical statement available about what the Shobu campaign had cost the Shobu group. When American Army medical officers weighed and examined the approximately 50,000 Japanese soldiers who surrendered in the Kiangan area, they recorded an average body weight of 94 pounds for adult male combatants. 94 pounds. The average body weight of an adult Japanese male in 1942 was approximately 133 pounds, already significantly lower than American averages of the period. The men who surrendered at Kiangan had lost, on average, approximately 39 pounds from their pre-war baseline. They had been consuming 150 grams of rice per day in their final months in the mountains. They were, in the plain language of physiology, starving men who had continued to occupy defensive positions and return fire because the alternative, surrender or a final assault that would end quickly, had not been available to them until the Emperor's voice came through the shortwave radio on the 15th of August and told them it was over. General Jonathan Wainwright was present at Kiangan for the surrender ceremony. This fact was MacArthur's personal arrangement, made without prior notice to Wainwright. Wainwright had surrendered the Philippines to Japanese forces in May of 1942 had handed over his own sword in a ceremony that was the formal acknowledgement of the worst American military defeat in the Pacific. He had spent more than 3 years as a prisoner, enduring conditions that left him physically depleted and recognizably changed from the man who had commanded Corregidor. He had been liberated from Xi'an prison camp in Manchuria only days before the Kiangan ceremony. He was flown to the Philippines specifically to be present when Yamashita signed the surrender documents. He stood in the Kiangan heat for 12 minutes. He did not speak. He was not required to speak. His presence was itself the statement that MacArthur had arranged for him to make. The man who had been forced to surrender was present when his captor's successor surrendered. History rarely provides this kind of structural closure, and when it does, the closure is never quite as clean as the ceremony suggests. Wainwright was emaciated. He was ill. He was standing in the sun in a mountain province of an island where 100,000 civilians had died in the city that bore his name. Wainwright was the street name assigned to a Manila boulevard during the occupation, as a Japanese humiliation. He stood for 12 minutes and watched. Yamashita's aide, Major Kishida, kept a diary throughout the campaign in the Cordillera, and the entry for the 2nd of September, 1945, describes the surrender ceremony from the Japanese side with the particular precision of a man recording something he knows will be the final entry. He describes Yamashita as composed and correct in every particular. He notes the weather, clear, warm. He notes the time of the formal signing. He notes the names of the American officers present. He notes the condition of the Shobu group soldiers who came down with Yamashita without editorial comment. Then, at the end of the entry, he writes, "The general cleaned his boots this morning before we descended. He said nothing about it. It was simply done." The American accounts of the same ceremony, the accounts written by the receiving officers, by the correspondents present, by the headquarters staff who processed the documentation, consistently describe Yamashita as broken, visibly defeated, a man reduced by circumstances. The two sets of accounts describe the same man on the same morning. The difference between them is not a matter of observable facts. It is a matter of what each observer needed the moment to mean. Yamashita was charged with war crimes on the 25th of September, 1945. The charge was a single count, that he had unlawfully disregarded and failed to discharge his duty as commander to control the operations of the members of his command, permitting them to commit brutal atrocities. The trial would begin on the 29th of October. Before it began, before the lawyers had made their opening statements, before a single witness had been called, General Douglas MacArthur had already issued a public statement describing the charges against Yamashita as reflecting the kind of military dishonor that the American campaign in the Philippines had been fought to oppose. The man who would subsequently review and confirm the sentence had publicly characterized the accused before the proceedings opened. Colonel Harry Clark, one of Yamashita's appointed American defense attorneys, noted this in his personal legal files preserved at the University of Minnesota Law Library. He noted it without rhetorical elaboration. He simply put it in the record, as a man who intended the record to be complete. The sword that Yamashita surrendered at Kiangan is one of the campaign's minor archival mysteries. The blade, reportedly made by a swordsmith of the late Edo period, a family heirloom by some accounts, was taken by General Wilhelm Steyr at the ceremony. A sword identified as Yamashita's is displayed at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. The memorial's own documentation acknowledges that the attribution is unverified. Where Yamashita's actual sword is, whether it is in Norfolk, in a private collection, in a museum storeroom somewhere, or simply lost in the post-war administrative process through which thousands of Japanese military items were catalogued, transferred, and occasionally misidentified, is not known. The sword matters less than the fact of its uncertainty. Even the most documented moments of this campaign contain unresolved questions at their edges. The archive is not a complete record. It never is. The Yamashita trial. Justice, vengeance, and the standard that outlived the war. The military commission convened on the 29th of October, 1945, in the ballroom of the High Commissioner's residence in Manila, was, by any technical legal measure, an unusual proceeding. It was convened under authority derived from MacArthur as Supreme Commander, the same MacArthur who had publicly characterized the defendant before the trial opened. The presiding officer was General Wilhelm Steyr, the same officer who had received Yamashita's surrender sword at Kiangan 7 weeks earlier. The rules of evidence governing the commission permitted hearsay testimony. They permitted the introduction of depositions from witnesses who were not present and could not be cross-examined. They permitted the commission members, who were military officers rather than lawyers, to weigh evidence under standards that diverged significantly from the rules applicable in any American civilian or military court. Colonel Harry Clark, one of Yamashita's 5 appointed American defense attorneys, wrote in his personal notes the second day of proceedings, "The Commission has ruled that hearsay is admissible. They have ruled that the normal rules of evidence do not apply. They are asking me to defend a man against charges that include atrocities he demonstrably could not have ordered, using rules of evidence that do not permit me to demonstrate this. I am not sure what I am doing in this room." The prosecution's case was built on 2 distinct categories of evidence that need to be understood separately because they were not equally strong. The first category, evidence of atrocities committed by Japanese forces in the Philippines, primarily but not exclusively in Manila, was extensive, credible, and devastating. 286 prosecution witnesses testified to killings, torture, the burning of occupied buildings, and the systematic massacre of civilians across multiple provinces and neighborhoods. Many were Filipino survivors of the Intramuros assault and the Paco and Ermita massacres. Their testimony was not manufactured and was not seriously contested by the defense. The atrocities happened. They were documented in sufficient detail and by sufficient numbers of independent witnesses to constitute a record beyond reasonable historical dispute. The prosecution's second category of evidence, evidence that Yamashita knew about the atrocities, or should have known about them, or had the ability to prevent them and chose not to, was significantly weaker. It was circumstantial. It rested primarily on the argument that a commander of Yamashita's seniority and experience in his area of responsibility must have known what his forces were doing. The commission accepted this argument. Clark spent much of the trial arguing that it was legally insufficient. The defense's core argument has 2 components that should be understood separately because their strength differs. The first component, that Yamashita was operationally separated from Manila during the period of the massacres, with his communications severed by American signals warfare, in a mountain headquarters 60 miles from the city, was factually well supported. The evidence that Yamashita's radio communications had been degraded by American signals intelligence operations from February onward was available in captured documents and American military records alike. The second component, that Admiral Iwabuchi's naval forces were not technically under Yamashita's command authority, but answered through a separate naval chain of command to the combined fleet, was structurally accurate but legally inconclusive. The Commission's response to both components was to rule that a commander is responsible for all forces operating in his area of responsibility, regardless of formal command channels, and that operational communication difficulties did not relieve a commander of the duty to know what his forces were doing. Clark's private response to this ruling, recorded in his notes. The Commission has decided that a commander is responsible for everything that happens in his area, whether he knows about it or not, whether he commands those forces or not. By that standard, no American commander in this war is innocent either. Clark never made that argument publicly at trial. He was not professionally positioned to make it. He put it in his notes. The trial lasted 39 days. 39 days from opening statement to verdict. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which tried 24 defendants for crimes that included the planning and execution of a war of aggression against multiple countries, and the industrial murder of 6 million people, lasted 218 days. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which tried 28 Japanese defendants for the broadest categories of war crimes and crimes against peace, lasted 870 days. Yamashita's commission tried one man, for one count, in 39 days. The sentence, death by hanging, was delivered on the 7th of December 1945, the 4th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. The date was not coincidental. Clark and his co-defense counsel petitioned the United States Supreme Court on the grounds that the military commission had violated Yamashita's constitutional rights to due process. The Supreme Court ruled 6-2 that it lacked jurisdiction over military commissions operating outside the continental United States. But two justices, Wiley Rutledge and Frank Murphy, filed dissents that are among the most pointed in the court's history. Justice Murphy wrote that the proceeding was hasty, superficial, and fundamentally unfair, and that the conviction rested on no evidence of personal participation or even actual knowledge. Justice Rutledge, in a dissent that runs to more than 30 pages of careful legal argument, wrote a single line that has been quoted in legal literature ever since. The difference between this proceeding and a lynch mob is that the commission has brass buttons. Rutledge was a careful lawyer, and not a man who wrote sentences like that casually. He wrote it because he meant it, and he published it in a Supreme Court dissent because he intended it to be in the permanent record of American legal history. MacArthur confirmed the sentence on the 7th of February, 1946. In his confirmation order, he wrote that Yamashita's conduct afflicted the most terrible of human crimes and reflected a blot upon civilization. The language was MacArthur's characteristic register, elevated, declarative, written for the record as he intended the record to read. Yamashita was hanged at Los Baños on the 23rd of February, 1946. His interpreter recorded his last words. "I pray that God has mercy on the Filipino people and the American people both. I bear no grudge against them." Kishida, his aide, was present. His diary records that Yamashita was composed to the end. The presiding officer problem, General Steyer having received Yamashita's surrender sword at Kiangan and then presiding over the commission that tried him, was raised formally by the defense and rejected by the commission without written reasoning. The rejection without written reasoning is itself a document. When a legal body declines to explain why a conflict of interest objection has been overruled, the absence of explanation functions as its own answer. Clark raised the objection because the record required that it be raised. The commission overruled it because the record required that it be processed. The proceeding moved forward because everyone present understood that it was going to move forward regardless of procedural objections, and the question before the defense was not whether to prevent the outcome, but whether to create a record sufficient to sustain an appeal. The appeal failed. The record exists. The Yamashita standard, the legal doctrine of command responsibility that the trial created or significantly extended, depending on which legal historian you ask, has a specific technical formulation that matters for understanding what the trial actually established. A superior officer is criminally liable for the actions of subordinates if a superior-subordinate relationship existed, if the superior knew, or had reason to know, the subordinates were about to commit or had committed criminal acts, and if the superior failed to prevent or punish those acts. The critical innovation of the Yamashita trial was the expansion of the knowledge element. Not knew, but had reason to know. A negligence standard applied to criminal liability. This is not a trivial legal distinction. Criminal law in most traditions requires proof of intent, or at least knowledge for conviction. The Yamashita Commission applied a negligence standard, what a reasonable commander should have known, to a charge that carried a death sentence. That expansion of the standard is the legal innovation that the trial bequeathed to international law, and it is the innovation that two Supreme Court justices found incompatible with due process. The doctrine survived their dissents. It has been applied in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in Iraq. It is currently active in proceedings at the International Criminal Court. The man they hanged at Los Baños in February of 1946 is present, in the legal language of those proceedings, as a precedent. His name appears in footnotes of briefs being argued in The Hague in 2024. The trial that lasted 39 days in a Manila ballroom is still doing legal work 80 years later. The archipelago after: legacy, debt, and what Luzon meant. There is a copy of the Philippine Independence Act dated the 4th of July, 1946, in the National Archives of the Philippines. It is a formal document, properly signed, properly sealed, properly preserved. Its preamble reads, "The United States of America hereby withdraws its sovereignty from the Philippine Islands and recognizes their independence." Below the formal text, in the archival copy, not in the official printed version, not in any record of the document's transmission, but specifically in the copy filed at the National Archives of the Philippines, someone has written a single word in pencil in the margin. The word is in Filipino. It is ano, which translates as so. The handwriting has never been identified. The National Archives staff cannot say when it was written or by whom. It might be a bureaucrat's dark joke. It might be a historian's annotation. It might be the reaction of someone whose family was in Intramuros on the 3rd of February, 1945, reading the document that told them they were now officially free. What it cannot be is nothing. Somebody picked up a pencil in the building that housed the documents of a newly sovereign nation and wrote, "So?" next to the sentence that granted that sovereignty. That penciled word is the most compressed commentary on the liberation of the Philippines that I have encountered in any archive. The Philippines that became independent on the 4th of July, 1946, chosen deliberately by the Americans as the date of independence, echoing their own declaration 170 years earlier, was a country in a specific and measurable condition. Approximately 1 million dead from all causes across the war years: combat, massacre, occupation atrocity, displacement, and the starvation that follows extended military occupation of an agricultural economy. The capital city was the second most destroyed urban environment in the entire Second World War, after Warsaw. The agricultural infrastructure of central Luzon had been disrupted by years of guerrilla activity, Japanese requisitions, and the movement of armies across the most productive farmland in the archipelago. The First Philippine Congress under the new republic convened in January of 1946 and faced simultaneously a destroyed capital, a shattered economy, an active armed insurgency in the countryside, and a demand from the United States, presented as a condition attached to the independence agreement itself, that the Philippines grant 99-year lease rights to 23 military bases as part of the military bases agreement. The country received sovereignty and a strategic dependency in the same transaction. The Hukbalahap insurgency that broke out within months of independence is the direct military consequence of the accounting decisions made during the campaign itself. The Hooks had fought Japanese occupation for 3 years across central Luzon with considerable effectiveness. They had been excluded from MacArthur's formal guerrilla recognition structure because they refused to subordinate their forces to his command, and because their communist political orientation made American headquarters deeply reluctant to certify them as Allied combatants. After the war, American certified guerrilla veterans received benefits under the Rescission Act of 1946. Hook fighters, who had fought the same enemy, in the same fields, against the same occupation, received nothing. Luis Taruc and his commanders understood precisely what this meant. The men who had been excluded from the official accounting of the liberation became the men who organized the insurgency against the government the liberation had installed. The connection between the 1945 recognition decisions and the 1946 insurgency outbreak is not theoretical. It is documented in Taruc's own writings and in the subsequent congressional investigation of the Hook Uprising. The insurgency was eventually suppressed, partly through genuine rural land reform, partly through military pressure, partly through the political skills of Ramon Magsaysay, the former guerrilla commander who became defense secretary and then president. The suppression took until approximately 1954. A decade after the liberation, the unresolved debts of the liberation were still producing armed conflict in the central Luzon plain. The military bases that the United States retained under the 1947 Military Bases Agreement, Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Station most prominently, defined the material terms of the Philippine-American relationship for the next 4 decades. The arrangement was, from an American strategic perspective, extraordinarily valuable. 2 of the largest overseas military installations in the world, in a geographic position that made them central to every Pacific military contingency, from Korea in 1950 to Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s. From a Philippine perspective, the value proposition was more complicated. The bases brought economic activity, employment, infrastructure, commerce around the perimeter, and they brought the formal security guarantee of the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1951. They also brought a permanent American military presence on sovereign Philippine territory, with jurisdiction arrangements that repeatedly generated political friction, and a relationship of strategic dependency that constrained Philippine foreign policy options for 40 years. When the Philippine Senate voted in 1991 not to renew the base lease, a decision that coincided, not entirely accidentally, with the Mount Pinatubo eruption that had just buried Clark under volcanic debris. It was voting on a question that had been present in Philippine politics since the conditions of independence were negotiated in 1946. The vote was about sovereignty. It was also, inescapably, about what the liberation had actually cost and who had actually paid for it. The physical reconstruction of Manila over the 8 decades since the battle is itself a kind of statement about the gap between what was destroyed and what has been recovered. The Intramuros that exists today, a walled district that functions as a tourist and historical zone in modern Manila, contains the original 16th century walls and the restored Fort Santiago, and a reconstruction of the Manila Cathedral that was completed in 1958 and bears no physical resemblance to the 17th century Baroque structure it replaced. The residential streets within the walls were rebuilt in the mid-20th century in styles appropriate to their era of construction, which was not the 16th century. Walking through Intramuros today, you walk through a space whose boundary walls are original and whose interior is entirely modern. A shell that survived surrounding a city that did not. The Philippine tourism materials describe Intramuros as a living historical district. It is, more precisely, a historical location with almost none of its historical fabric intact. The distinction matters to the people who study what was lost, and to the families who had relatives in those streets in February of 1945. And it matters less, or differently, to the vendors and schoolchildren and tourists who inhabit the present version of the place. Both relationships to the space are legitimate. Neither is the whole story. The full accounting of Filipino civilian dead from the Luzon campaign, not just Manila, but the entire island, over the entire campaign period, from January through August of 1945, has never been completed to the satisfaction of the researchers who have attempted it. The Philippine War Damage Commission's 1946 estimate of approximately 200,000 total war-related civilian deaths across the Philippines, of which roughly 100,000 were in Manila, was compiled under severe time and resource constraints in the immediate post-war period. Academic researchers working with municipal death records, genealogical documentation, and provincial archives in subsequent decades have produced estimates ranging from 340,000 to 400,000 total Luzon civilian deaths for the campaign period. The range reflects genuine uncertainty in the underlying data, rather than ideological difference in interpretation. Many records were destroyed in the fighting. Many deaths occurred in areas where no official documentation survived. Many families whose members died in the campaign did not file formal documentation with a commission that was operating for 18 months in a country trying simultaneously to rebuild its entire administrative infrastructure. The gap between 100,000 and 400,000, 300,000 human beings, represents the outer boundary of what is not known, and may never be known, about what the Luzon campaign cost the people who lived there. The 15th of August, 1945, is the date on which Japan announced its surrender. It is also the date on which the Battle of Luzon officially ended, the date the army designated as the campaign's terminal point. On that date, approximately 50,000 soldiers of Yamashita's Shobu group were still in the mountains around Kiangan, still armed, still occupying prepared positions, consuming the last of their pre-positioned supplies. They had been fighting, in increasing isolation and decreasing physical condition, for 7 months since the Lingayen landing. They had tied down 5 American divisions in the Cordillera for essentially the entire campaign period. They had achieved, in the most narrow and devastating sense, the delay objective that Imperial General Headquarters had assigned Yamashita when they sent him to Luzon, knowing he could not win. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August. Japan announced surrender on the 15th. The men in the mountains who had been fighting to buy time for a negotiated peace heard the Emperor's voice through a shortwave radio and began, over the following 18 days, the process of coming down. Yamashita cleaned his boots. He came down to Kiangan. He surrendered. And the question of what all of it had been for, the 100,000 dead in Manila, the 39 days of trial, the penciled "ano" in the margin of the independence document, does not have an answer that any archive can provide cleanly. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, currently being negotiated between Manila and Washington in early 2026, includes provisions for renewed American military access to bases on Luzon. Access that would place American forces in positions of direct strategic relevance to Taiwan contingency planning and South China Sea security scenarios. The geographic logic of those provisions is identical to the geographic logic that brought 68,000 Americans to Lingayen Gulf in January of 1945. The same mountains to the north, the same relationship between Luzon's airfields and the sea lanes to the west. The same calculation about what American military presence on the Philippines' main island means for the balance of power across the Western Pacific. The Luzon campaign did not settle these questions. It established the framework within which the questions would continue to be asked. The framework is still standing. The questions are still open. Bataan Day, the 9th of April, the anniversary of the American surrender in 1942, is a national public holiday in the Philippines. The 9th of January, the day American forces landed at Lingayen in 1945 and began the liberation of the main island, is not. The Philippines has chosen to mark the day its defenders were defeated over the day its liberators arrived. That choice is not ingratitude. It is a precise statement about which event the Filipino people have decided deserves permanent national memory and why. The defeat of April of 1942 was unambiguously theirs. Filipino and American soldiers fighting together, losing together, beginning together the resistance that would sustain itself for 3 years until help arrived. The liberation of January of 1945 was something more complicated. An American military operation, conducted for American strategic purposes, that liberated Filipinos as a consequence of those purposes, rather than as their primary aim, and that in the process of liberating them, destroyed their capital city and killed 100,000 of their civilians, and paid 29 cents on the dollar for the destruction when the lawyers finished. Bataan Day is the anniversary they keep. The liberation is the event they commemorate with the ruins of Intramuros and the sealed sections of Malinta Tunnel, and the penciled word in the margin of the Independence Act. Ano? So? The question is still in the archive. It has not been answered. It will not be answered by adding another documentary to the record. But it can be heard, if the record is read carefully enough, and if the reader is willing to sit with the discomfort of a question that the evidence does not resolve. The archive is large enough to hold the question. Whether we are willing to hold it with the archive is a different matter entirely.